Section 42 of A Popular History of France, Volume 4. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Recording by Kathy Barrett. A Popular History of France from the Earliest Times, Volume 4, by François Guizot, translated by Robert Black. Chapter 33. Charles IX and the Religious Wars, 1560 to 1574, Part 8. The king was hunting at Brie. The queen mother went and joined him. She shut herself up with him in a cabinet, and bursting into tears, she said, "I should never have thought that in return for having taken so much pains to bring you up and preserve to you the crown, you would have had heart to make me so miserable a recompense. You hide yourself from me, me who am your mother, in order to take counsel of your enemies. I know that you hold secret councils with the admiral. You desire to plunge rashly into war with Spain, in order to give your kingdom, yourself, and the persons that are yours over as a prey to them of the religion. I am so miserable a creature, yet before I see that, give me leave to withdraw to the place of my birth. Remove from you your brother, who may call himself unfortunate in having employed his own life to preserve yours. Give him at least time to withdraw out of danger, and from the presence of enemies made in doing you service. Huguenots who desire not war with Spain, but with France, and the subversion of all the estates in order to set up themselves." Tavannes himself terms these expressions "an artful harangue," but he says, "it moved, astounded, and dismayed the king, not so much on the score of the Huguenots as of his mother and brother, whose subtlety, ambition, and power in the state he knew. He marveled to see his counsels thus revealed. He avowed them, asked pardon, promised obedience. Having sown this distrust, having shot this first bolt, the queen mother, still in displeasure, withdrew to Monceau. The trembling king followed her. He found her with his brother and Sieur de Tavannes, de Retz, and the Secretary of State, de Sauve, the last of whom threw himself upon his knees and received the Majesty's pardon for having revealed his counsels to his mother. The infidelity, the bravado, the audacity, the menaces, and the enterprises of the Huguenots were magnified with so much of truth and art that from friends behold them converted into enemies of the king, who, nevertheless, wavering as ever, could not yet give up the desire he had conceived of winning glory and reputation by war with Spain." A fresh incident increased the agitation in the royal circle. In July 1572 the throne of Poland had become vacant. A Polish embassy came to offer it to the Duke of Anjou. On his part and his mother's there was at first great eagerness to accept it. Catherine was charmed to see her favorite son becoming a king. "If we had required," says a Polish historian, "that the French should build a bridge of solid gold over the Vistula, they would have agreed." Hesitation soon took the place of eagerness. Henry demanded information, and took time to reply. He had shown similar hesitation at the time of the negotiations entered upon in London in 1572, with a view of making him the husband of Elizabeth, Queen of England. Coligny, who was very anxious to have him away, pressed Charles IX. To insist upon a speedy solution. "If Monsieur," said he, "who would not have England by marriage, will not have Poland either by election, let him declare once and for all that he will not leave France." The relations between the two brothers became day by day more uncomfortable. 2 years later, Henry, for a brief period King of Poland, himself told the story of them to his physician Miron. "When by any chance," he said, "the queen mother and I, after the admiral's departure, approached the king to speak to him of any matters, even those which concerned merely his pleasure, we found him marvellously quick tempered and cross grained, with rough looks and bearing, and his answers still more so. One day, a very short time before the St. Bartholomew, setting out expressly from my quarters to go and see the king, somebody told me on inquiry that he was in his cabinet, whence the admiral, who had been alone with him a very long while, had just that instant gone out. I entered at once, as I had been accustomed to do. But as soon as the king my brother perceived me, he, without saying anything to me, began walking about furiously and with long steps, often looking towards me askance and with a very evil eye, sometimes laying his hand upon his dagger, and in so excited a fashion that I expected nothing else but that he would come and take me by the collar to poniard me. I was very vexed that I had gone in, reflecting upon the peril I was in, but still more upon how to get out of it. which I did so dexterously that whilst he was walking with his back turned to me, I retreated quickly towards the door, which I opened, and with a shorter obeisance than at my entry, I made my exit, which was scarcely perceived by him until I was outside. And straightway I went to look for the queen my mother, and putting together all reports, notifications, and suspicions, the time and past circumstances, in conjunction with this last meeting, we remained, both of us, easily persuaded, and as it were certain, that it was the admiral who had impressed the king with some bad and sinister opinion of us, and we resolved from that moment to rid ourselves of him." One idea immediately occurred to Catherine and her son. Two persons felt a passionate hatred towards Coligny. They were the widow of Duke Francis of Guise, Anne d'Este, become Duchess of Nemours by a second marriage, and her son Henri de Guise, a young man of 22. They were both convinced that Coligny had egged on Poltrot to murder Duke Francis, and they had sworn to exact vengeance. Being informed of the queen mother's and the Duke of Anjou's intention, they entered into it eagerly. The young Duke of Guise believed his mother quite capable of striking down the admiral in the very midst of one of the great assemblies at court. The fair ladies of the 16th century were adepts in handling dagger and pistol. In default of the Duchess of Nemours, her son was thought of for getting rid of Coligny. "It was at one time decided," says the Duke of Bouillon in his Memoires, "that M. de Guise should kill the admiral during a tilt at the ring which the king gave in the garden of the Louvre, and which all messieurs were to lead sides. I was on that of the duke, who was believed to have an understanding with the admiral. On this occasion it was so managed that our dresses were not ready, and the late duke and his side did not tilt at all. The resolution against the admiral was changed prudently, inasmuch as it was very perilous for the person of the king and of Monsieur to have determined to kill him in that place, there being present more than 400 gentlemen of the religion, who might have gone very far in case of an assault upon that lord who was so much beloved by them." Everything considered, it was thought more expedient to employ for the purpose an inferior agent. Catherine and the Duke of Anjou sent for a Gascon captain, a dependent of the house of Lorraine, whom they knew to be resolute and devoted. "We had him shown the means he should adopt," says the Duke of Anjou, "in attacking him who we had in our eye; but having well scanned him, himself, and his movements, and his speech and his looks, which had made us laugh and afforded us good pastime, we considered him too harebrained and too much of a windbag to deal the blow well." They then applied to an officer "of practice and experience in murder," Charles de Louviers, Sieur de Maurevert, who was called the king's slaughterman, or le tueur du roi, because he had already rendered such a service, and they agreed with him as to all the circumstances of place, time, and procedure most likely to secure the success of the deed, whilst giving the murderer chances of escape. In such situations there is scarcely any project the secret of which is so well kept that there does not get abroad some rumor to warn an observant mind. And when it is the fate of a religious or a popular hero that is in question, there is never any want of devoted friends or servants about him, ready to take alarm for him. When Coligny mounted his horse to go from Chatillon to Paris, a poor countrywoman on his estates threw herself before him, sobbing, "Ah, sir, ah! Our good master, you are going to destruction. I shall never see you again if once you go to Paris. You will die there, you and all those who go with you." At Paris, on the approach of the St. Bartholomew, the admiral heard that some of his gentlemen were going away. "They treat you too well here," said one of them, Langoiran, to him; "better to be saved with the fools than lost for the sake of being thought over wise." The admiral was beset by letters which reminded him of the queen mother's crooked ways, and the detestable education of the king, trained to every sort of violence and horrible sin. His Bible is Machiavelli. He has been prepared by the blood of beasts for the shedding of human blood. He has been persuaded that a prince is not bound to observe an edict extorted by his subjects." To all these warnings Coligny replied at one time by affirming the king's good faith, and at another by saying, "I would rather be dragged dead through the muck heaps of Paris than go back to civil war." This great soul had his seasons, not of doubt as to his faith, or discouragement as to his cause, but of profound sorrow at the atrocious or shameful spectacles and the public or private woes which had to be gone through. Charles IX. himself felt some disquietude as to the meeting of the Guises and Coligny at his court. The Guises had quitted it before the 18th of August, the day fixed for the marriage of King Henry of Navarre with Marguerite de Valois. When the marriage was over, they were to return, and they did. At the moment of their returning, the king said to Coligny, with demonstrations of the most sincere friendship, "You know, my dear father, the promise you made me not to insult any of the Guises as long as you remained at court. On their side, they have given me their word that they will have for you, and all the gentry of your following, the consideration you deserve. I rely entirely upon your word, but I have not so much confidence in theirs. I know that they are only looking for an opportunity of letting their vengeance burst forth. I know their bold and haughty character, and as they have the people of Paris devoted to them, and as on coming hither under pretext of the rejoicings at my sister's marriage, they have brought a numerous body of well-armed soldiers, I should be inconsolable if they were to take anything in hand against you. Such an outrage would recoil upon me. That being so, if you think as I do, I believe the best thing for me is to order into the city the regiment of guards, with such and such captains. He mentioned none but those who were not objects of suspicion to Coligny. This reinforcement, added the king, will secure public tranquillity, and if the factious make any disturbance, there will be men to oppose to them." The admiral assented to the king's proposal. He added that he was ready to declare "that never had he been guilty or approving of the death of Duke Francis of Guise, and that he set down as a calumniator and a scoundrel whoever said that he had authorized it." Though frequently going to the palace, both he and the Guises, they had not spoken when they met. Charles had promised the Lorraine princes "not to force them to make friends with Coligny more than was agreeable to them." He believed that he had taken every precaution necessary to maintain in his court, for some time at least, the peace he desired. On Friday the 22d of August, 1572, Coligny was returning on foot from the Louvre to the Rue des Fosses, Saint Germain Auxerrois, where he lived. He was occupied in reading a letter which he had just received. A shot, fired from the window of a house in the cloister of Saint Germain l'Auxerrois, smashed 2 fingers of his right hand and lodged a ball in his left arm. He raised his eyes, pointed out with his injured hand the house whence the shot had come, and reached his quarters on foot. 2 gentlemen who were in attendance upon him rushed to seize the murderer. It was too late. Maurevert had been lodging there and on the watch for 3 days at the house of a canon, an old tutor to the Duke of Guise. A horse from the duke's stable was waiting for him at the back of the house, and having done his job, he departed at a gallop. He was pursued for several leagues without being overtaken. Coligny sent to apprise the king of what had just happened to him. "There," said he, "was a fine proof of fidelity to the agreement between him and the Duke of Guise." "I shall never have rest then," cried Charles, breaking the stick with which he was playing tennis with the Duke of Guise and Teligny, the admiral's son-in-law, and he immediately returned to his room. The Duke of Guise took himself off without a word. Teligny speedily joined his father-in-law. Ambrose Père had already attended to him, cutting off the 2 broken fingers. Somebody expressed a fear that the balls might have been poisoned. "It will be as God pleases as to that," said Coligny, and turning towards the minister, Merlin, who had hurried to him, he added, "Pray that he may grant me the gift of perseverance." Towards midday, Marshals de Damville, de Cosse, and de Villars went to see him, "out of pure friendship," they told him, "and not to exhort him to endure his mishap with patience. We know that you will not lack patience." "I do protest to you," said Coligny, "that death affrights me not. It is of God that I hold my life. When he requires it back from me, I am quite ready to give it up. But I should very much like to see the king before I die. I have to speak to him of things which concern his person and the welfare of his state, and which I feel sure none of you would dare to tell him of." "I will go and inform his Majesty," rejoined Damville, and he went out with Villars and Teligny, leaving Marshal de Cosse in the room. "Do you remember," said Coligny to him, "the warnings I gave you a few hours ago? You will do well to take your precautions." About 2 p.m., the king, the queen mother, and the Dukes of Anjou and Alencon, her 2 other sons, with many of their high officers, repaired to the admiral's. "My dear father," said the king as he went in, "the hurt is yours, the grief and the outrage mine; but I will take such vengeance that it shall never be forgotten." To which he added his usual imprecations. "Then the admiral, who lay in bed sorely wounded," says the Duke of Anjou himself, in his account of this interview, "requested that he might speak privately to the king, which the king granted readily, making a sign to the queen my mother, and to me, to withdraw, which we did incontinently into the middle of the room, where we remained standing during this secret colloquy, which caused us great misgiving. We saw ourselves surrounded by more than 200 gentlemen and captains of the admiral's party, who were in the room and another adjoining, and besides in the ball below, the which, with sad faces and the gestures and bearing of malcontents, were whispering in one another's ears, frequently passing and repassing before and behind us, not with so much honor and respect as they ought to have done, and as if they had some suspicion that we had somewhat to do with the admiral's hurt. We were seized with astonishment and fear at seeing ourselves shut in there, as my mother has since many times confessed to me, saying that she had never been in any place where there was so much cause for fright, and whence she had gone away with more relief and pleasure. This apprehension caused us to speedily break in upon the conversation the admiral was having with the king, under a polite excuse invented by the queen my mother, who, approaching the king, said out loud that she had no idea he would make the admiral talk so much, and that she saw quite well that his physicians and surgeons considered it bad for him, as it certainly was very dangerous, and enough to throw him into a fever, which was, above everything, to be guarded against. She begged the king to put off the rest of their conversation to another time, when the admiral was better. This vexed the king mightily, for he was very anxious to hear the remainder of what the admiral had to say to him. However, he being unable to gainsay so specious an argument, we got the king away; and incontinently the queen mother and I too begged the king to let us know the secret conversation which the admiral had held with him, and in which he had been unwilling that we should be participators, which the king refused several times to do. But finding himself importuned and hard pressed by us, he told us abruptly and with displeasure, swearing by God's death that what the admiral said was true, that kings realized themselves as such in France only in so far as they had the power of doing harm or good to their subjects and servants, and that this power and management of affairs had slipped imperceptibly into the hands of the queen my mother and mine. This superintendent dominion, the admiral told me, might some day be very prejudicial to me and to all my kingdom, and that I should hold it in suspicion and beware of it, of which he was anxious to warn me, as one of my best and most faithful subjects, before he died. There, God's death, as you wish to know, is what the admiral said to me. This, said as it was with passion and fury, went straight home to our hearts, which we concealed as best we might, both of us, however, defending ourselves in the matter. We continued this conversation all the way from the admiral's quarters to the Louvre, where, having left the king in his room, we retired to that of the queen my mother, who was piqued and hurt to the utmost degree at this language used by the admiral to the king, as well as at the credence which the king seemed to accord it, and was fearful lest it should bring about some change and alteration in our affairs and in the management of the state. Being unable to resolve upon any course at the moment, we retired, putting off the question till the morrow, when I went to see my mother, who was already up. I had a fine racket in my head, and so had she, and for the time there was no decision come to, save to have the admiral dispatched by some means or other. It being impossible any longer to employ stratagems and artifices, it would have to be done openly, and the king brought round to that way of thinking. We agreed that in the afternoon we would go and pay him a visit in his closet, whither we would get the Sieur de Nevers, Marshals de Tavannes and de Retz, and Chancellor de Birague to come, merely to have their opinion as to the means to be adopted for the execution, which we had already determined upon, my mother and I." End of section 42. Section 43 of A Popular History of France, Volume 4. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Recording by Kathy Barrett. A Popular History of France from the Earliest Times, Volume 4, by François Guizot. Translated by Robert Black. Chapter 33. Charles IX and the Religious Wars, 1560 to 1574, Part 9. On Saturday, the 23rd of August, in the afternoon, the queen mother, the Duke of Anjou, Marshals de Tavannes and de Retz, the Duke of Nevers, and the Chancellor de Birague met in the king's closet, who was irresolute and still talking of exacting from the Guises heavy vengeance for the murderous attack upon Coligny. Catherine, represented to him that the party of the Huguenots had already seized this occasion for taking up arms against him. They had sent, she said, several dispatches to Germany to procure a levy of 10,000 reiters, and to the cantons of the Swiss for another levy of 10,000 foot. The French captains, partisans of the Huguenots, had already, most of them, set out to raise levies within the kingdom. Time and place of meeting had already been assigned and determined. All the Catholics on their side, added Catherine, disgusted with so long a war and harassed by so many kinds of calamities, have resolved to put a stop to them. They have decided amongst them to elect a captain general, to form a league offensive and defensive against the Huguenots. The whole of France would thus be seen armed and divided into two great parties, between which the king would remain isolated, without any command and with about as much obedience. For so much ruin and calamity in anticipation and already within a finger's reach, and for the slaughter of so many thousands of men, a preventive may be found in a single sword thrust. All that is necessary is to kill the admiral, the head and front of all the civil wars. The designs and the enterprises of the Huguenots will die with him, and the Catholics, satisfied with the sacrifice of 2 or 3 men, will remain forever in obedience to the king." At the beginning, continues the Duke of Anjou in his account, the king would not by any means consent to have the admiral touched. Feeling, however, some fear of the danger which we had so well depicted and represented, to him he desired that, in a case of such importance, every one should at once state his opinion." When each of those present had spoken, the king appeared still undecided. The queen mother then resolved "to let him hear the truth in toto from Marshal de Retz, from whom she knew that he would take it better than from any other," says his sister Marguerite de Valois in her Memoires, "as one who was more in his confidence and favor than any other, the which came to see him in the evening about 9 or 10, and told him that, as his faithful servant, he could not conceal from him the danger he was in if he were to abide by his resolution to do justice on M. de Guise, because it was necessary that he should know that the attack upon the admiral was not M. de Guise's doing alone, but that my brother Henry the King of Poland, afterwards King of France, and the queen my mother had been concerned in it, which M. de Guise and his friends would not fail to reveal, and which would place his Majesty in a position of great danger and embarrassment." Towards midnight, the queen mother went down to the king, followed by her son Henry and 4 other councillors. They found the king more put out than ever. The conversation began again, and resolved itself into a regular attack upon the king. "The Guises," he was told, "will denounce the king himself, together with his mother and brother. The Huguenots will believe that the king was in concert with the party, and they will take the whole royal family to task. War is inevitable. Better to win a battle in Paris, where we hold all the chiefs in our clutches, than put it to hazard in the field." After a struggle of an hour and a half, Charles, in a violent state of agitation, still hesitated. When the queen mother, fearing lest, if there were further delay, all would be discovered, said to him, "Permit me and your brother, sir, to retire to some other part of the kingdom." Charles rose from his seat. "By God's death," said he, "since you think proper to kill the admiral, I consent; but all the Huguenots in Paris as well, in order that there remain not one to reproach me afterwards. Give the orders at once." And he went back into his room. In order to relieve and satisfy her own passions and those of her favorite son, which were fear and love of power, the queen mother had succeeded in working her king's son into a fit of weakness and mad anger. Anxious to profit by it, "she gave orders on the instant for the signal, which was not to have been given until an hour before daybreak," says de Thou, "and instead of the bell at the Palace of Justice, the tocsin was sounded by the bell at Saint Germain Auxerrois, which was nearer." Even before the king had given his formal consent, the projectors of the outrage had carefully prepared for its execution. They had apportioned out amongst themselves or to their agents the different quarters of the city. The Guises had reserved for themselves that in which they considered they had personal vengeance as well as religious enmity to satisfy. The neighborhood of Saint Germain l'Auxerrois, and especially Rue de Bethisy and Rue des Fosses Saint Germain. Awakened by the noise around his house, and before long by arquebuse shots fired in his courtyard, Coligny understood what was going to happen. He jumped out of bed, put on his dressing gown, and as he stood leaning against the wall, he said to the clergyman Merlin, who was sitting up with him, "Monsieur Merlin, say me a prayer, I commit my soul to my Saviour." One of his gentlemen, Cornaton, entered the room. "What is the meaning of this riot?" asked Ambrose Pare, who had also remained with the admiral. "My lord," said Cornaton to Coligny, "it is God calling us." "I have long been ready to die," said the admiral, "but you, my friends, save yourselves if it is still possible." All ran upstairs and escaped, the majority by the roof. A German servant, Nicholas Muss, alone remained with the admiral, "as little concerned," says Cornaton, "as if there were nothing going on around him." The door of his room was forced. Two men, servants of the Guises, entered first. One of them, Bem, attached to the Duke of Guise's own person, came forward, saying, "Art thou not the admiral?" "Young man," said Coligny, "thou comest against a wounded and an aged man; thou'lt not shorten my life by much." Bem plunged into his stomach a huge pointed boar spear which he had in his hand, and then struck him on the head with it. Coligny fell, saying, "If it were but a man, but 'tis a horse boy." Others came in and struck him in their turn. "Bem," shouted the Duke of Guise from the courtyard, "hast done?" "'Tis all over, my lord," was the answer, and the murderers threw the body out of the window, where it stuck for an instant, either accidentally or voluntarily, and as if to defend a last remnant of life. Then it fell. The two great lords who were waiting for it turned over the corpse, wiped the blood off the face, and said, "Faith, 'tis he, sure enough." Some have said that Guise gave him a kick in the face. A servant of the Duke of Nevers cut off the head, and took it to the queen mother, the king, and the Duke of Anjou. It was embalmed with care, to be sent, it is said, to Rome. What is certain is that a few days afterwards Mandelot, governor of Lyons, wrote to the king, "I have received, sir, the letter your Majesty was pleased to write to me, whereby you tell me that you have been advertised that there is a man who has set out from over yonder with the head he took from the admiral after killing him, for to convey it to Rome, and to take care, when the said man arrives in this city, to have him arrested, and to take from him the said head. Whereupon I incontinently gave such strict orders that if he presents himself, the command which it pleases your Majesty to lay upon me will be acted upon. There hath not passed for these last few days, by way of this city, any person going Romewards, save a squire of the Duke of Guise's, named Paul, the which had departed 4 hours previously on the same day on which I received the said letter from your Majesty." We do not find anywhere, in reference to this incident, any information going further than this reply of the governor of Lyons to Charles IX. However it may be, the remains of Coligny's body, after having been hung and exposed for some days on the gibbet of Montfaucon, were removed by Duke Francis de Montmorency, the admiral's relative and friend, who had them transferred to Chantilly and interred in the chapel of the castle. After having been subjected, in the course of 3 centuries, at one time to oblivion and at others to diverse transferences, these sad relics of a great man, a great Christian, and a great patriot have been resting, for the last 22 years, in the very castle of Chatillon-sur-Loing, his ancestors' own domain having once more become the property of a relative of his family, the Duke of Luxembourg, to whom Count Anatole de Montesquieu transferred them, and who in 1851 had them sealed up in a bit of wall in ruins, at the foot of an old tower, under the site of the bedchamber of the Duchesses of Chantillon, where in all probability Coligny was born. The more tardy the homage, the greater. The actual murderers of Coligny, the real projectors of the St. Bartholomew, Catherine de' Medici and her son the Duke of Anjou, at the very moment when they had just ordered the massacre, were seized with affright at the first sound of their crime. The Duke of Anjou finishes his story with this page: "After but 2 hours' rest during the night, just as the day was beginning to break, the king, the queen my mother, and I went to the frontal of the Louvre, adjoining the tennis court, into a room which looks upon the area of the stable yard, to see the commencement of the work. We had not been there long when, as we were weighing the issues and the consequence of so great an enterprise, on which, sooth to say, we had up to that time scarcely bestowed a thought, we heard a pistol shot fired. I could not say in what spot, or whether it knocked over anybody, but well know I that the sound wounded all 3 of us so deeply in spirit that it knocked over our senses and judgment, stricken with terror and apprehension at the great troubles which were then about to set in. To prevent them, we sent a gentleman at once and with all haste to M. de Guise, to tell him and command him expressly from us to retire into his quarters, and be very careful to take no steps against the admiral, this single command putting a stop to everything else, because it had been determined that in no spot in the city should any steps be taken until, as a preliminary, the admiral had been killed. But soon afterwards the gentleman returning told us that M. de Guise had answered him that the command came too late, that the admiral was dead, and the work was begun throughout the rest of the city. So we went back to our original determination, and let ourselves follow the thread and the course of the enterprise." The enterprise, in fact, followed its thread and natural course without its being in the power of anybody to arrest or direct it. It had been absolutely necessary to give information of it the evening before to the provost of tradesmen of Paris, Le Charron, president in the court of taxation, or board of excise, and to the chief men of the city. According to Brantome, "they made great difficulties and imported conscience into the matter, but M. de Tavannes, in the king's presence, rebuked them strongly, and threatened them that if they did not make themselves busy the king would have them hanged. The poor devils, unable to do aught else, thereupon answered, 'Ha! is that the way you take it, sir? And you, monsieur? We swear to you that you shall hear news thereof, for we will ply our hands so well right and left that the memory shall abide for ever of a right well kept St. Bartholomew.'" "Wherein they did not fail," continues Brantome, "but they did not like it at first." According to other reports, the first opposition of the provost of tradesmen, the Charron, was not without effect. It was not till the next day that he let the orders he had received take their course, and it was necessary to apply to his predecessor in his office, the ex provost Marcel, a creature of the queen mother's, to set in motion the turbulent and the fanatical amongst the populace, "which it never does to blood, for it is afterwards more savage than is desirable." Once let loose upon the St. Bartholomew, the Parisian populace was eager indeed, but not alone in its eagerness, for the work of massacre. The gentlemen of the court took part in it passionately, from a spirit of vengeance, from religious hatred, from the effect of smelling blood, from covetousness at the prospect of confiscations at hand. Teligny, the admiral's son-in-law, had taken refuge on a roof. The Duke of Anjou's guards make him a mark for their arquebuses. La Rochefoucauld, with whom the king had been laughing and joking up to 11 o'clock the evening before, heard a knocking at his door, in the king's name. It is opened. Enter 6 men in masks and poniard him. The new Queen of Navarre, Marguerite de Valois, had gone to bed by express order of her mother Catherine. "Just as I was asleep," says she, "behold a man knocking with feet and hands at the door, and shouting, 'Navarre, Navarre!' My nurse, thinking it was the king my husband, runs quickly to the door and opens it. It was a gentleman named M. de Larran, who had a sword cut on the elbow, a gash from a halberd on the arm, and was still pursued by 4 archers, who all came after him into my bedroom. He, wishing to save himself, threw himself on to my bed. As for me, feeling this man who had hold of me, I threw myself out of bed towards the wall, and he after me, still holding me round the body. I did not know this man, and I could not tell whether he had come thither to offer me violence, or whether the archers were after him in particular, or after me. We both screamed, and each of us was as much frightened as the other. At last it pleased God that M. de Nanqay, captain of the guards, came in, who, finding me in this plight, though he felt compassion, could not help laughing, and flying into a great rage with the archers for this indiscretion, he made them begone, and gave me the life of that poor man who had hold of me, whom I had put to bed and attended to in my closet until he was well." End of section 43. Section 44 of A Popular History of France, Volume 4. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Recording by Kathy Barrett. A Popular History of France from the Earliest Times, Volume 4, by François Guizot. Translated by Robert Black. Chapter 33. Charles IX and the Religious Wars, 1560 to 1574, Part 10. We might multiply indefinitely these anecdotical scenes of the massacre, most of them brutally ferocious, others painfully pathetic, some generous and calculated to preserve the credit of humanity amidst one of its most direful aberrations. History must show no pity for the vices and crimes of men, whether princes or people; and it is her duty as well as her right to depict them so truthfully that men's souls and imaginations may be sufficiently impressed by them to conceive disgust and horror at them. But it is not by dwelling upon them and by describing them minutely, as if she had to exhibit a gallery of monsters and madmen, that history can lead men's minds to sound judgments and salutary impressions. It is necessary to have moral sense and good sense always in view, and set high above great social troubles, just as sailors, to struggle courageously against the tempest, need to see a luminous corner where the sky is visible, and a star which reveals to them the port. We take no pleasure, and we see no use, in setting forth in detail the works of evil. We should be inclined to fear that by familiarity with such a spectacle men would lose the perception of good, and cease to put hope in its legitimate and ultimate superiority. Nor will we pause either to discuss the secondary questions which meet us at the period of which we are telling the story. For example, the question whether Charles IX fired with his own hand on his Protestant subjects, whom he had delivered over to the evil passions of the aristocracy and of the populace, or whether the balcony from which he is said to have indulged in this ferocious pastime existed at that time, in the 16th century, at the palace of the Louvre and overlooking the Seine. These questions are not without historic interest, and it is well for learned men to study them, but we consider them incapable of being resolved with certainty, and even were they resolved, they would not give the key to the character of Charles IX, and to the portion which appertains to him in the deed of cruelty with which his name remains connected. The great historic fact of the St. Bartholomew is what we confine ourselves to, and we have attempted to depict it accurately as regards Charles IX.'s hesitations and equally feverish resolutions, his intermixture of open-heartedness and double-dealing in his treatment of Coligny, towards whom he felt himself drawn without quite understanding him, and his puerile weakness in presence of his mother, whom he feared far more than he trusted. When he had plunged into the orgies of the massacre, when, after having said, "Kill them all," he had seen the slaughter of his companions in his royal amusements, Teligny and La Rochefoucauld, Charles IX. Abandoned himself to a fit of mad passion. He was asked whether the two young Huguenot princes, Henry of Navarre and Henry de Conde, were to be killed also. Marshal de Retz had been in favor of it, Marshal de Tavannes had been opposed to it, and it was decided to spare them. On the very night of the St. Bartholomew, the king sent for them both. "I mean for the future," said he, "to have but one religion in my kingdom, the mass or death, make your choice." Henry of Navarre reminded the king of his promises, and asked for time to consider. Henry de Conde "answered that he would remain firm in the true religion, though he should have to give up his life for it." "Seditious madman, rebel, and son of a rebel," said Charles, "if within 3 days you do not change your language, I will have you strangled." At this first juncture, the king saved from the massacre none but his surgeon, Ambrose Pare, and his nurse, both Huguenots. On the very night after the murder of Coligny, he sent for Ambrose Pare into his chamber, and made him go into his wardrobe, says Brantome, ordering him not to stir, and saying that it was not reasonable that one who was able to be of service to a whole little world should be thus massacred. A few days afterwards, "Now," said the king to Pare, "you really must be a Catholic." "By God's light," answered Pare, "I think you must surely remember, sir, to have promised me, in order that I might never disobey you, never, on the other hand, to bid me do four things: find my way back into my mother's womb, catch myself fighting in a battle, leave your service, or go to mass." After a moment's silence, Charles rejoined, "Ambrose, I don't know what has come over me for the last 2 or 3 days, but I feel my mind and my body greatly excited, in fact, just as if I had a fever. Meseems every moment, just as much waking as sleeping, that those massacred corpses keep appearing to me with their faces all hideous and covered with blood. I wish the helpless and the innocent had not been included." "And in consequence of the reply made to him," adds Sully in his Economie Royale, page 244 in the Petitot collection, "he next day issued his orders, prohibiting, on pain of death, any slaying or plundering; the which were, nevertheless, very ill observed, the animosities and fury of the populace being too much inflamed to defer to them." The historians, Catholic or Protestant, contemporary or researchful, differ widely as to the number of the victims in this cruel massacre. According to de Thou, there were about 2,000 persons killed in Paris the first day. D'Aubigne says 3,000. Brantome speaks of 4,000 bodies that Charles IX. Might have seen floating down the Seine. La Popeliniere reduces them to 1,000. There is to be found in the account books of the city of Paris a payment to the grave diggers of the cemetery of the Innocents for having interred 1,100 dead bodies, stranded at the turns of the Seine near Chaillot, Auteuil, and Saint Cloud. It is probable that many corpses were carried still farther, and the corpses were not all thrown into the river. The uncertainty is still greater when one comes to speak of the number of victims throughout the whole of France. De Thou estimates it at 30,000, Sully at 70,000. Perefixe, Archbishop of Paris in the 17th century, raises it to 100,000. Papirius Masson and de Villa reduce it to 10,000, without clearly distinguishing between the massacre of Paris and those of the provinces. Other historians fix upon 40,000. Great uncertainty also prevails as to the execution of the orders issued from Paris to the governors at the provinces. The names of the Viscount d'Ordre, governor of Bayonne, and of John le Hennuyer, bishop of Lisieux, have become famous from their having refused to take part in the massacre; but the authenticity of the letter from the Viscount d'Ordre to Charles IX. Is disputed, though the fact of his resistance appears certain. And as for the bishop, John le Hennuyer, M. de Formeville seems to us to have demonstrated in his Histoire de l'ancien évêque Comte de Lisieux, pages 299 to 314, "that there was no occasion to save the Protestants of Lisieux in 1572, because they did not find themselves in any danger of being massacred, and that the merit of it cannot be attributed to anybody, to the bishop, le Hennuyer, any more than to Captain Fumichon, governor of the town. It was only the general course of events and the discretion of the municipal officers of Lisieux that did it all." One thing which is quite true, and which is good to call to mind in the midst of so great a general criminality, is that at many spots in France it met with a refusal to be associated in it. President Genin at Dijon, the Count de Tende in Provence, Philibert de Leguiche at Mâcon, Tanguy le Venard de Carouge at Rouen, the Count de Gordes in Dauphiny, and many other chiefs, military or civil, openly repudiated the example set by the murderers of Paris; and the municipal body of Nantes, a very Catholic town, took upon this subject, as has been proved from authentic documents by M. Verigot, pastor of the Reformed Church at Nantes, a resolution which does honor to its patriotic firmness as well as to its Christian loyalty. A great good man, a great functionary, and a great scholar, in disgrace for 6 years past, the Chancellor Michael de l'Hospital, received, about this time, in his retreat at Vignay, a visit from a great philosopher, Michael de Montaigne, "anxious," said the visitor, "to come and testify to you the honor and reverence with which I regard your competence and the special qualities which are in you; for as to the extraneous and the fortuitous, it is not to my taste to put them down in the account." Montaigne chose a happy moment for disregarding all but the personal and special qualities of the chancellor. Shortly after his departure, L'Hospital was warned that some sinister looking horsemen were coming, and that he would do well to take care of himself. "No matter, no matter," he answered; "it will be as God pleases when my hour has come." Next day he was told that those men were approaching his house, and he was asked whether he would not have the gates shut against them, and have them fired upon in case they attempted to force an entrance. "No," said he, "if the small gate will not do for them to enter by, let the big one be opened." A few hours afterwards, L'Hospital was informed that the king and the queen mother were sending other horsemen to protect him. "I didn't know," said the old man, "that I had deserved either death or pardon." A rumor of his death flew abroad amongst his enemies, who rejoiced at it. "We are told," wrote Cardinal Granvelle to his agent at Brussels, October 8, 1572, "that the king has had Chancellor de l'Hospital and his wife dispatched, which would be a great blessing." The agent, more enlightened than his chief, denied the fact, adding, "They are a fine bit of rubbish left, L'Hospital and his wife." Charles IX. wrote to his old adviser to reassure him, "loving you as I do." Some time after, however, he demanded of him his resignation of the title of chancellor, wishing to confer it upon La Birague, to reward him for his co operation in the St. Bartholomew. L'Hospital gave in his resignation on the 1st of February, 1573, and died 6 weeks afterwards, on the 18th of March. "I am just at the end of my long journey, and shall have no more business but with God," he wrote to the king and the queen mother. "I implore him to give you his grace, and to lead you with his hand in all your affairs, and in the government of this great and beautiful kingdom which he hath committed to your keeping, with all gentleness and clemency towards your good subjects, in imitation of himself, who is good, and patient in bearing our burdens, and prompt to forgive you and pardon you everything." From the 24th to the 31st of August, 1572, the bearing and conduct of Charles IX. And the queen mother produced nothing but a confused mass of orders and counter orders, affirmations and denials, words and actions incoherent and contradictory, all caused by a habit of lying and the desire of escaping from the peril or embarrassment of the moment. On the very first day of the massacre, about midday, the provost of tradesmen and the sheriffs, who had not taken part in the "Paris matins," came complaining to the king "of the pillage, sack, and murder which were being committed by many belonging to the suite of his Majesty, as well as to those of the princes, princesses, and lords of the court, by noblemen, archers, and soldiers of the guard, as well as by all sorts of gentry and people mixed with them and under their wing." Charles ordered them "to get on horseback, take with them all the forces in the city, and keep their eyes open day and night to put a stop to the said murder, pillage, and sedition arising," he said, "because of the rivalry between the houses of Guise and Chatillon, and because they of Guise had been threatened by the admiral's friends, who suspected them of being at the bottom of the hurt inflicted upon him." He, the same day, addressed to the governors of the provinces a letter in which he invested the disturbance with the same character, and gave the same explanation of it. The Guises complained violently at being thus disavowed by the king, who had the face to throw upon them alone the odium of the massacre which he had ordered. Next day, August 25, the king wrote to all his agents, at home and abroad, another letter, affirming that "what had happened at Paris had been done solely to prevent the execution of an accursed conspiracy which the admiral and his allies had concocted against him, his mother, and his brothers." And on the 26th of August he went with his 2 brothers to hold in state a bed of justice, and make to the Parliament the same declaration against Coligny and his party. "He could not," he said, "have parried so fearful a blow but by another very violent one; and he wished all the world to know that what had happened at Paris had been done not only with his consent, but by his express command." Whereupon it was enjoined upon the court, says de Thou, "to cause investigations to be made as to the conspiracy of Coligny, and to decree what it should consider proper, conformably with the laws and with justice." The next day but one, August 28, appeared a royal manifesto, running, "The king willeth and intendeth that all noblemen and others whosoever of the religion styled Reformed be empowered to live and abide in all security and liberty, with their wives, children, and families, in their houses, as they have heretofore done, and were empowered to do by the benefit of the edicts of pacification. And nevertheless, for to obviate the troubles, scandals, suspicion, and distrust which might arise by reason of the services and assemblies that might take place both in the houses of the said noblemen and elsewhere, as is permitted by the aforesaid edicts of pacification, his Majesty doth lay very express inhibitions and prohibitions upon all the said noblemen and others of the said religion against holding assemblies on any account whatsoever, until that, by the said lord the king, after having provided for the tranquillity of his kingdom, it be otherwise ordained. and that on pain of confiscation of body and goods in case of disobedience." These tardy and lying accusations officially brought against Coligny and his friends. These promises of liberty and security for the Protestants, renewed in the terms of the edicts of pacification, and, in point of fact, annulled at the very moment at which they were being renewed. The massacre continuing here and there in France, at one time with the secret connivance, and at another notwithstanding the publicly given word of the king and the queen mother. All this policy, at one and the same time violent and timorous, incoherent and stubborn, produced amongst the Protestants two contrary effects. Some grew frightened, others angry. At court, under the direct influence of the king and his surroundings, "submission to the powers that be," prevailed. Many fled; others, without abjuring their religion, abjured their party. The two reformer princes, Henry of Navarre and Henry de Conde, attended mass on the 29th of September, and on the 3rd of October wrote to the pope, deploring their errors and giving hopes of their conversion. Far away from Paris, in the mountains of the Pyrenees and of Languedoc, in the towns where the Reformers were numerous and confident, at Sancerre, at Montauban, at Nimes, at La Rochelle, the spirit of resistance carried the day. An assembly, meeting at Milhau, drew up a provisional ordinance for the government of the Reformed Church, "until it please God, who has the hearts of kings in his keeping, to change that of King Charles IX. And restore the state of France to good order, or to raise up such neighboring prince as is manifestly marked out, by his virtue and by distinguishing signs, for to be the liberator of this poor afflicted people." In November 1572, the fourth religious war broke out. The siege of La Rochelle was its only important event. Charles IX. And his councillors exerted themselves in vain to avoid it. There was everything to disquiet them in this enterprise. So sudden a revival of the religious war after the grand blow they had just struck, the passionate energy manifested by the Protestants in asylum at La Rochelle, and the help they had been led to hope for from Queen Elizabeth, whom England would never have forgiven for indifference in this cause. Marshal de Biron, who was known to favor the Reformers, was appointed governor of La Rochelle; but he could not succeed in gaining admittance within the walls, even alone and for the purpose of parleying with the inhabitants. The king heard that one of the bravest Protestant chiefs, La Noue Iron Arm, had retired to Mons with Prince Louis of Nassau. The Duke of Longueville, his old enemy, induced him to go to Paris. The king received him with great favor, gave up to him the property of Teligny, whose sister La Noue had married, and pressed him to go to La Rochelle and prevail upon the inhabitants to keep the peace. La Noue refused, saying that he was not at all fitted for this commission. The king promised that he would ask nothing of him which could wound his honor. La Noue at last consented, and repaired, about the end of November 1572, to a village close by La Rochelle, whither it was arranged that deputies from the town would come and confer with him. And they came, in fact, but at their first meeting, "We are come," they said, "to confer with M. de La Noue, but we do not see him here." La Noue got angry. "I am astonished," he said, "that you have so soon forgotten one who has received so many wounds and lost an arm fighting for you." "Yes, there is a M. de La Noue, who was one of us, and who bravely defended our cause, but he never flattered us with vain hopes; he never invited us to conferences to betray us." La Noue got more fiercely angry. "All I ask of you is to report to the Senate what I have to say to them." They complied, and came back with permission for him to enter the town. The people looked at him, as he passed, with a mixture of distrust and interest. After hearing him, the Senate rejected the pacific overtures made to them by La Noue. "We have no mind to treat specially and for ourselves alone. Our cause is that of God and of all the churches of France. We will accept nothing but what shall seem proper to all our brethren. For yourself, we give you your choice between three propositions: remain in our town as a simple burgess, and we will give you quarters. If you like better to be our commandant, all the nobility and the people will gladly have you for their head, and will fight with confidence under your orders. If neither of these propositions suits you, you shall be welcome to go aboard one of our vessels and cross over to England, where you will find many of your friends." La Noue did not hesitate. He became, under the authority of the mayor Jacques Henri, the military head of La Rochelle, whither Charles IX. Had sent him to make peace. The king authorized him to accept this singular position. La Noue conducted himself so honorably in it, and everybody was so convinced of his good faith as well as bravery, that for 3 months he commanded inside La Rochelle and superintended the preparations for defence, all the while trying to make the chances of peace prevail. At the end of February, 1573, he recognized the impossibility of his double commission, and he went away from La Rochelle, leaving the place in better condition than that in which he had found it, without either king or Rochellese considering that they had any right to complain of him. End of section 44. Section 45 of A Popular History of France, Volume 4. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Recording by Kathy Barrett. A Popular History of France from the Earliest Times, Volume 4, by François Guizot. Translated by Robert Black. Chapter 33. Charles IX and the Religious Wars, 1560 to 1574, Part 11. Biron first, and then the Duke of Anjou in person, took the command of the siege. They brought up, it is said, 40,000 men and 60 pieces of artillery. The Rochellese, for defensive strength, had but 22 companies of refugees or inhabitants, making in all 3,100 men. The siege lasted from the 26th of February to the 13th of June, 1573. 6 assaults were made on the place. In the last, the ladders had been set at night against the wall of what was called Gospel Bastion. The Duke of Guise, at the head of the assailants, had escaladed the breach, but there he discovered a new ditch and a new rampart erected inside. And confronted by these unforeseen obstacles, the men recoiled and fell back. La Rochelle was saved. Charles IX was more and more desirous of peace. His brother, the Duke of Anjou, had just been elected King of Poland. Charles IX was anxious for him to leave France and go to take possession of his new kingdom. Thanks to these complications, the Peace of La Rochelle was signed on the 6th of July, 1573. Liberty of creed and worship was recognized in the 3 towns of La Rochelle, Montauban, and Nimes. They were not obliged to receive any royal garrison on condition of giving hostages to be kept by the king for 2 years. Liberty of worship throughout the extent of their jurisdiction continued to be recognized in the case of Lords High Justiciary. Everywhere else the Reformers had promises of not being persecuted for their creed, under the obligation of never holding an assembly of more than 10 persons at a time. These were the most favorable conditions they had yet obtained. Certainly this was not what Charles IX had calculated upon when he consented to the massacre of the Protestants. "Provided," he had said, "that not a single one is left to reproach me." The massacre had been accomplished almost without any resistance but that offered by certain governors of provinces or towns, who had refused to take part in it. The chief leader of French Protestantism, Coligny, had been the first victim. Far more than that, the Parliament of Paris had accepted the royal lie which accused Coligny of conspiring for the downfall of the king and the royal house. A decree on that very ground sentenced to condemnation the memory, the family, and the property of Coligny, with all sorts of rigorous, we should rather say atrocious, circumstances. And after having succeeded so well against the Protestants, Charles IX saw them recovering again, renewing the struggle with him, and wresting from him such concessions as he had never yet made to them. More than ever might he exclaim, "Then I shall never have rest." The news that came to him from abroad was not more calculated to satisfy him. The St. Bartholomew had struck Europe with surprise and horror, not only amongst the princes and in the countries that were Protestant, in England, Scotland, and northern Europe, but in Catholic Germany itself there was a very strong feeling of reprobation. The Emperor Maximilian II and the Elector Palatine Frederick III, called the Pious, showed it openly. When the Duke of Anjou, elected King of Poland, went through Germany to go and take possession of his kingdom, he was received at Heidelberg with premeditated coolness. When he arrived at the gate of the castle, not a soul went to meet him. Alone he ascended the steps, and found in the hall a picture representing the massacre of St. Bartholomew. The elector called his attention to the portraits of the principal victims, amongst others that of Coligny, and at table he was waited upon solely by French Protestant refugees. At Rome itself, in the midst of official satisfaction and public demonstrations of it exhibited by the pontifical court, the truth came out, and Pope Gregory XIII. Was touched by it when certain of my lords the cardinals, who were beside him, asked wherefore he wept, and was sad at so goodly a despatch of those wretched folk, enemies of God and of his holiness. I weep, said the pope, at the means the king used, exceeding unlawful and forbidden of God, for to inflict such punishment. I fear that one will fall upon him, and that he will not have a very long bout of it, or will not live very long. I fear, too, that amongst so many dead folk there died as many innocent as guilty." Only the King of Spain, Philip II., a fanatical despot and pitiless persecutor, showed complete satisfaction at the event, and he offered Charles IX. The assistance of his army, if he had need of it, against what there was remaining of heretics in his kingdom. Charles IX. Had not mind or character sufficiently sound or sufficiently strong to support without great perturbation the effect of so many violent, repeated, and often contradictory impressions. Catherine de' Medici had brought up her three sons solely with a view of having their confidence and implicit obedience. "All the actions of the queen mother," said the Venetian ambassador Sigismund Cavalli, who had for a long while resided at her court, "have always been prompted and regulated by one single passion, the passion of ruling." Her son Charles had yielded to it without an effort in his youth. "He was accustomed to say that until he was 25 he meant to play the fool, that is to say, to think of nothing but of enjoying his heyday. Accordingly, he showed aversion for speaking and treating of business, putting himself altogether in his mother's hands. Now he no longer thinks and acts in the same way. I have been told that since the late events he requires to have the same thing said more than 3 times over by the queen before obeying her." It was not with regard to his mother only that Charles had changed. "His looks," says Cavalli, "have become melancholy and sombre. In his conversations and audiences he does not look the speaker in the face; he droops his head, closes his eyes, opens them all at once, and, as if he found the movement painful, closes them again with no less suddenness. It is feared that the demon of vengeance has possessed him. He used to be merely severe; it is feared that he is becoming cruel. He is temperate in his diet, drinks nothing but water. To tire himself at any price is his object. He remains on horseback for 12 or 14 consecutive hours, and so he goes hunting and coursing through the woods the same animal, the stag, for 2 or 3 days, never stopping but to eat, and never resting but for an instant during the night." He was passionately fond of all bodily exercises, the practice of arms, and the game of tennis. "He had a forge set up for himself," says Brantome, "and I have seen him forging cannon and horseshoes and other things as stoutly as the most robust farriers and forgemen." He at the same time showed a keen and intelligent interest in intellectual works and pleasures. He often had a meeting in the evening of poets, men of letters, and artists: Ronsard, Amadis Jamin, Jodelle, Dorat, Baeff. In 1570 he gave them letters patent for the establishment of an Academy of Poetry and Music, the first literary society founded in France by a king; but it disappeared amidst the civil wars. Charles IX. Himself sang in the choir, and he composed a few hunting airs. Ronsard was a favorite, almost a friend, with him. He used to take him with him on his trips, and give him quarters in his palace, and there was many an interchange of verse between them, in which Ronsard did not always have the advantage. Charles gave a literary outlet to his passion for hunting. He wrote a little treatise entitled La Chasse Royale, which was not published until 1625, and of which M. Henri Chevreul brought out, in 1857, a charming and very correct edition. Charles IX. Dedicated it to his lieutenant of the hunt, Mesnil, in terms of such modest and affectionate simplicity that they deserve to be kept in remembrance. "Mesnil," said the king, "I should feel myself far too ungrateful, and expect to be chidden for presumption, if in this little treatise that I am minded to make upon stag hunting I did not, before any one begins to read it, avow and confess that I learned from you what little I know. I beg you also, Mesnil, to be pleased to correct and erase what there is wrong in the said treatise, the which, if peradventure it is so done that there is nothing more required than to reword and alter, the credit will be firstly yours for having so well taught me, and then mine for having so well remembered. Well, then, having been taught by so good a master, I will be bold enough to essay it, begging you to accept it as heartily as I present it and dedicate it to you." These details and this quotation are allowable in order to shed full light upon the private and incoherent character of this king, who bears the responsibility of one of the most tragic events in French history. In the spring of 1574, at the age of 23 years and 11 months, and after a reign of 11 years and 6 months, Charles IX. Was attacked by an inflammatory malady, which brought on violent hemorrhage. He was revisited in his troubled sleep by the same bloody visions about which, a few days after the St. Bartholomew, he had spoken to Ambrose Pare. He no longer retained in his room anybody but 2 of his servants and his nurse, "of whom he was very fond, although she was an Huguenot," says the contemporary chronicler Peter de l'Estoile. "When she had lain down upon the chest and was just beginning to doze, hearing the king moaning, weeping, and sighing, she went full gently up to the bed. 'Ah, nurse, nurse,' said the king, 'what bloodshed and what murders! Ah, what evil counsel have I followed! O my God, forgive me them, and have mercy upon me, if it may please thee. I know not what hath come to me, so bewildered and agitated do they make me. What will be the end of it all? What shall I do? I am lost, I see it well.' Then said the nurse to him, 'Sir, the murders be on the heads of those who made you do them. Of yourself, sir, you never could; and since you are not consenting thereto, and are sorry therefore, believe that God will not put them down to your account, and will hide them with the cloak of justice of his Son, to whom alone you must have recourse. But for God's sake, let your Majesty cease weeping.' And thereupon, having been to fetch him a pocket handkerchief, because his own was soaked with tears, after that the king had taken it from her hand, he signed to her to go away and leave him to his rest." On Sunday, May 30, 1574, Whit Sunday, about 3 in the afternoon, Charles IX. expired, after having signed an ordinance conferring the regency upon his mother Catherine, "who accepted it," was the expression in the letters patent, at the request of the Duke of Alençon, the King of Navarre, and other princes and peers of France. According to D'Aubigne, Charles used often to say of his brother Henry that, "when he had a kingdom on his hands, the administration would find him out, and that he would disappoint those who had hopes of him." The last words he said were, "that he was glad not to have left any young child to succeed him, very well knowing that France needs a man, and that with a child the king and the reign are unhappy." End of section 45. Section 46 of A Popular History of France, Volume 4. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Recording by Kathy Barrett. A Popular History of France from the Earliest Times, Volume 4, by François Guizot. Translated by Robert Black. Chapter 34. Henry III and the Religious Wars, 1574 to 1589, Part 1. Though elected King of Poland on the 9th of May, 1573, Henry, Duke of Anjou, had not yet left Paris at the end of the summer. Impatient at his slowness to depart, Charles IX. Said, with his usual oath, "By God's death, my brother or I must at once leave the kingdom. My mother shall not succeed in preventing it." "Go," said Catherine to Henry, "you will not be away long." She foresaw, with no great sorrow, one would say, the death of Charles IX., and her favorite son's accession to the throne of France. Having arrived in Poland on the 25th of January, 1574, and been crowned at Cracow on the 24th of February, Henry had been scarcely 4 months King of Poland when he was apprised, about the middle of June, that his brother Charles had lately died, on the 30th of May, and that he was King of France. "Do not waste your time in deliberating," said his French advisers. "You must go and take possession of the throne of France without abdicating that of Poland. Go at once and without fuss." Henry followed this counsel. He left Cracow on the 18th of June, with a very few attendants. Some Poles were apprehensive of his design, but said nothing about it. He went a quarter of a league on foot to reach the horses which were awaiting him, set off at a gallop, rode all night, and arrived next day early on the frontier of Moravia, an Austrian province. The royal flight created a great uproar at Cracow. The noblemen, and even the peasants, armed with stakes and scythes, set out in pursuit of their king. They did not come up with him; they fell in with his chancellor only, Guy de Fort, Sieur de Pibrac, who had missed him at the appointed meeting place, and who, whilst seeking to rejoin him, had lost himself in the forests and marshes, concealed himself in the osiers and reeds, and been obliged now and then to dip his head in the mud to avoid the arrows discharged on all sides by the peasants in pursuit of the king. Being arrested by some people who were for taking him back to Cracow and paying him out for his complicity in his master's flight, he with great difficulty obtained his release and permission to continue his road. Destined to become more celebrated by his writings and by his quatrains moraux than by his courtly adventures, Pibrac rejoined King Henry at Vienna, where the Emperor Maximilian II received him with great splendor. Delivered from fatigue and danger, Henry appeared to think of nothing but resting and diverting himself. He tarried to his heart's content at Vienna, Venice, Ferrara, Mantua, and Turin. He was everywhere welcomed with brilliant entertainments, which the Emperor Maximilian and the senators of Venice accompanied with good advice touching the government of France in her religious troubles; and the nominal sovereign of 2 kingdoms took nearly 3 months in going from that whence he had fled to that of which he was about to take possession. Having started from Cracow on the 18th of June, 1574, he did not arrive until the 5th of September at Lyons, whither the queen mother had sent his brother, the Duke of Alencon, and his brother-in-law, the King of Navarre, to receive him, going herself as far as Bourgoin in Dauphiny in order to be the first to see her darling son again. The king's entry into France caused, says de Thou, a strange revulsion in all minds. During the lifetime of Charles IX. None had seemed more worthy of the throne than Henry, and everybody desired to have him for master; but scarcely had he arrived when disgust set in, to the extent of auguring very ill of his reign. There was no longer any trace in this prince, who had been nursed, so to speak, in the lap of war, of that manly and warlike courage which had been so much admired. He no longer rode on horseback. He did not show himself amongst his people, as his predecessors had been wont to do. He was only to be seen shut up with a few favorites in a little painted boat which went up and down the Saône. He no longer took his meals without a balustrade, which did not allow him to be approached by any hearer; and if anybody had any petitions to present to him, they had to wait for him as he came out from dinner, when he took them as he hurried by. For the greater part of the day he remained closeted with some young folks, who alone had the prince's ear, without anybody's knowing how they had arrived at this distinction, whilst the great, and those whose services were known, could scarcely get speech of him. Showiness and effeminacy had taken the place of the grandeur and majesty which had formerly distinguished our kings. The time was ill chosen by Henry III. For this change of habits and for becoming an indolent and voluptuous king, set upon taking his pleasure in his court and isolating himself from his people. The condition and ideas of France were also changing, but to issue in the assumption of quite a different character and to receive development in quite a different direction. Catholics or Protestants, agents of the king's government or malcontents, all were getting a taste for, and adopting the practice, of independence and of vigorous and spontaneous activity. The bonds of the feudal system were losing their hold, and were not yet replaced by those of a hierarchically organized administration. Religious creeds and political ideas were becoming, for thoughtful and straightforward spirits, rules of conduct, powerful motives of action, and they furnished the ambitious with effective weapons. The theologians of the Catholic Church and of the Reformed churches, on one side the Cardinal of Lorraine, Cardinals Campeggio and Sadolet, and other learned priests or prelates, and on the other side Calvin, Theodore de Beze, Melanchthon, and Bucer, were working with zeal to build up into systems of dogma their interpretations of the great facts of Christianity, and they succeeded in implanting a passionate attachment to them in their flocks. Independently of these religious controversies, superior minds, profound lawyers, learned scholars were applying their energies to founding, on a philosophical basis and historic principles, the organization of governments and the reciprocal rights of princes and peoples. Ramus, one of the last and of the most to be lamented victims of the St. Bartholomew, Francis Hotman, who, in his Franco-Gallia, aspired to graft the new national liberties upon the primitive institutions of the Franks, Hubert Languet, the eloquent author of the Vindicici contra Tyrannos, or de la puissance légitime du prince sur le peuple et du peuple sur le prince, John Bodin, the first in original merit amongst the publicists of the 16th century, in his Six Livres de la République, all these eminent men boldly tackled the great questions of political liberty or of legislative reforms. Le Contre un, that republican treatise by de la Boétie, written in 1546, and circulated at first in manuscript only, was inserted, between 1576 and 1578, in the Mémoires de l'État de France, and passionately extolled by the independent thinker Michael de Montaigne in his Essai, of which 9 editions were published between 1580 and 1598, and evidently very much read in the world of letters. An intellectual movement so active and so powerful could not fail to have a potent effect on political life. Before the St. Bartholomew, the great religious and political parties, the Catholic and the Protestant, were formed and at grips. The House of Lorraine at the head of the Catholics, and the House of Bourbon, Conde, and Coligny at the head of the Protestants, with royalty trying feebly and vainly to maintain between them a hollow peace. To this stormy and precarious, but organized and clearly defined condition, the St. Bartholomew had caused anarchy to succeed. Protestantism, vanquished but not destroyed, broke up into provincial and municipal associations without recognized and dominant heads, without discipline or combination in respect of either their present management or their ultimate end. Catholicism, though victorious, likewise underwent a break-up. Men of mark, towns and provinces would not accept the St. Bartholomew and its consequences. A new party, the party of the policists, sprang up, opposed to the principle and abjuring the practice of persecution, having no mind to follow either the Catholics in their outrages or royalty in its tergiversations, and striving to maintain in the provinces and the towns, where it had the upper hand, enough of order and of justice to at least keep at a distance the civil war which was elsewhere raging. Languedoc owed to Marshal de Danville, second son of the Constable Anne de Montmorency, this comparatively bearable position. But the degree of security and of local peace which it offered the people was so imperfect, so uncertain, that the break-up of the country and of the state went still farther. In a part of Languedoc, in the Vivarais, the inhabitants, in order to put their habitations and their property in safety, resolved to make a league amongst themselves, without consulting any authority, not even Marshal de Danville, the peace-seeking governor of their province. Their treaty of alliance ran that arms should be laid down throughout the whole of the Vivarais, that none, foreigner or native, should be liable to trouble for the past, that tillers of the soil and traders should suffer no detriment in person or property, that all hostilities should cease in the towns and all forays in the country, that there should everywhere be entire freedom for commerce, that cattle which had been lifted should be immediately restored gratis, that concerted action should be taken to get rid of the garrisons out of the country and to raise the fortresses, according as the public weal might require, and finally that whosoever should dare to violate these regulations should be regarded as a traitor and punished as a disturber of the public peace. As soon as the different authorities in the state, Marshal de Danville as well as the rest, were informed of this novelty, says de Thou, they made every effort to prevent it from taking effect. Nothing could be of more dangerous example, they said, than to suffer the people to make treaties in this way and on their own authority, without waiting for the consent of His Majesty or of those who represented him in the provinces. The folks of the Vivarais, on the contrary, presumed to justify themselves by saying that the step they had taken did not in any way infringe the king's authority, that it was rather an opening given by them for securely establishing tranquillity in the kingdom, that nothing was more advantageous, or could contribute more towards peace, than to raise all those fortresses set up in the heart of the state, which were like so many depots of revolt, that by a diminution of the garrisons the revenues of His Majesty would be proportionately augmented, that at any rate there would result this advantage, that the lands, which formed almost the whole wealth of the kingdom, would be cultivated, that commerce would flourish, and that the people, delivered from fear of the many scoundrels who found a retreat in those places, would at last be able to draw a breath after the many misfortunes they had experienced." It was in this condition of disorganization and red-hot anarchy that Henry III., on his return from Poland and after the St. Bartholomew, found France. It was in the face of all these forces, full of life, but scattered and excited one against another, that, with the aid of his mother, Catherine, he had to re-establish unity in the state, the effectiveness of the government, and the public peace. It was not a task for which the tact of an utterly corrupted woman and an irresolute prince sufficed. What could the artful manoeuvrings of Catherine and the waverings of Henry III. Do towards taming both Catholics and Protestants at the same time, and obliging them to live at peace with one another, under one equitable and effective power? Henry IV. Was as yet unformed, nor was his hour yet come for this great work. Henry III. And Catherine de' Medici failed in it completely. Their government of 15 years served only to make them lose their reputation for ability, and to aggravate for France the evils which it was their business to heal. In 1575, a year only after Henry III's accession, revolt penetrated to the royal household. The Duke of Alençon, the king's younger brother, who, since his brother's coronation, took the title of Duke of Anjou, escaped on the 15th of September from the Louvre by a window, and from Paris by a hole made in the wall of circumvallation. He fled to Dreux, a town in his appanage, and put himself at the head of a large number of malcontents, nobles and burgesses, Catholic and Reformed, mustered around him under this name of no religious significance between the two old parties. On the 17th of September, in his manifesto, he gave as reasons for his revolt excessive taxation, waste of the public revenues, the feebleness of the royal authority, incapable as it was of putting a stop to the religious troubles, and the disgrace which had been inflicted upon himself "by pernicious ministers who desire to have the government in their sole patronage, excluding from it the foremost and the most illustrious of the court, and devouring all that there is remaining to the poor people." He protested his devotion to the king his brother, at the same time declaring war against the Guises. King Henry of Navarre, testifying little sympathy with the Duke of Anjou, remained at court, abandoning himself apparently to his pleasures alone. Two of his faithful servants, the poet historian D'Aubigne was one of them, heard him one night sighing as he lay in bed, and humming half aloud this versicle from the 88th Psalm: "Removed from friends, I sigh alone, in a loathed dungeon laid, where none a visit will vouchsafe to me, confined past hope of liberty." "Sir," said D'Aubigne eagerly, "it is true, then, that the Spirit of God worketh and dwelleth in you still? You sigh unto God because of the absence of your friends and faithful servants, and all the while they are together, sighing because of yours and laboring for your freedom. But you have only tears in your eyes, and they, arms in hand, are fighting your enemies. As for us too, we were talking of taking to flight to morrow, when your voice made us draw the curtain. Bethink you, sir, that after us the hands that will serve you would not dare refuse to employ poison and the knife." Henry, much moved, resolved to follow the example of the Duke of Anjou. His departure was fixed for the 3rd of February, 1576. He went and slept at Senlis, hunted next day very early, and on his return from hunting, finding his horses baited and ready, "What news?" he asked. "Sir," said D'Aubigne, "we are betrayed; the king knows all; the road to death and shame is Paris; that to life and glory is anywhere else." "That is more than enough; away!" replied Henry. They rode all night, and arrived without misadventure at Alençon. 250 gentlemen, having been apprised in time, went thither to join the King of Navarre. He pursued his road in their company. From Senlis to the Loire he was silent, but when he had crossed the river, "Praised be God who has delivered me," he cried. "At Paris they were the death of my mother; there they killed the admiral and my best servants; and they had no mind to do any better by me, if God had not had me in his keeping. I return thither no more unless I am dragged. I regret only two things that I have left behind at Paris: Mass and my wife. As for Mass, I will try to do without it; but as for my wife, I cannot. I mean to see her again." He disavowed the appearances of Catholicism he had assumed, again made open profession of Protestantism by holding at the baptismal font in the conventicle the daughter of a physician amongst his friends. Then he reached Bearn, declaring that he meant to remain there independent and free. A few days before his departure, he had written to one of his Bearnese friends, "The court is the strangest you ever saw. We are almost always ready to cut one another's throats. We wear daggers, shirts of mail, and very often the whole cuirass under the cape. I am only waiting for the opportunity to deliver a little battle, for they tell me they will kill me, and I want to be beforehand." Mesdames de Carnavalet and de Sauvé, two of his fair friends, had warned him that, far from giving him the lieutenant generalship which had been so often promised him, it had been decided to confer this office on the king's brother, in order to get him back to court and seize his person as soon as he arrived. Section 47 of A Popular History of France, Volume 4. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Recording by Kathy Barrett. A Popular History of France from the Earliest Times, Volume 4, by François Guizot. Translated by Robert Black. Chapter 34. Henry III and the Religious Wars, 1574 to 1589, Part 2. It was the increasing preponderance of the Guises, at court as well as in the country, which caused the two princes to take this sudden resolution. Since Henry III's coming to the throne, war had gone on between the Catholics and the Protestants, but languidly and with frequent suspensions through local and short-lived truces. The king and the queen mother would have been very glad that the St. Bartholomew should be short-lived also, as a necessary but transitory crisis. It had rid them of their most formidable adversaries, Coligny and the Reformers of note who were about him. Henry and Catherine aspired to no more than resuming their policy of manoeuvring and wavering between the two parties engaged in the struggle; but it was not for so poor a result that the ardent Catholics had committed the crime of the St. Bartholomew. They promised themselves from it the decisive victory of their church and of their supremacy. Henry de Guise came forward as their leader in this grand design. There are to be read, beneath a portrait of him done in the 16th century, these verses, also of that date: "The virtue, greatness, wisdom from on high, of yonder duke, triumphant far and near, do make bad men to shrink with coward fear, and God's own Catholic Church to fructify. In armor clad, like maddened Mars he moves, the trembling Huguenot cowers at his glance. A prop for Holy Church is his good lance, his eye is ever mild to those he loves." Guise cultivated very carefully this ardent confidence on the part of Catholic France. He recommended to his partisans attention to little pious and popular practices. "I send you some paternosters," meaning, in the plural, the beads of a chaplet, or the chaplet entire. He wrote to his wife, Catherine of Cleves, "You will have strings made for them, and string them together. I don't know whether you dare offer some of them to the queens and to my lady mother. Ask advice of Mesdames de Retz and de Villeroy about it." The flight and insurrection of the Duke of Anjou and the King of Navarre furnished the Duke of Guise with a very natural occasion for re engaging in the great struggle between Catholicism and Protestantism, wherein the chief part belonged to him. Let us recur for a moment to the origin of that struggle and the part taken in it at the outset by the princes of the House of Lorraine. "As early as the year 1562, 26 years before the affair of the barricades," says M. Vitet in the excellent introduction which he has put at the head of his beautiful historic dramas from the last half of the 16th century, "Cardinal Charles of Lorraine, being at the Council of Trent, conceived the plan of a Holy League, or association of Catholics, which was to have the triple object of defending by armed force the Romish Church in France, of obtaining for the cardinal's brother, Duke Francis de Guise, the lieutenant generalship of the kingdom, and of helping him to ascend the throne, in case the line of the Valois should become extinct. The death of Duke Francis, murdered in front of Orleans by Poltrot, did not permit the cardinal to carry out his plan. 5 years afterwards, Henry de Guise, eldest son of Francis, and then 18 years of age, caused to be drawn up, for the first time, a form of oath whereby the dignitaries bound themselves to sacrifice their goods and lives in defence of the Catholic religion in the face of and against all, except the king, the royal family, and the princes of their connection. This form was signed by the nobility of Champagne and Brie, a province of which Henry de Guise was governor, and on the 25th of July, 1568, the bishop and the clergy of Troyes signed it likewise. The association is named in the form Holy League, Christian and Royal. Up to the year 1576 it remained secret, and did not cross the boundaries of Champagne. To this summary of M. Vitéz may be added that, independently of the Champagnese League of 1568, and in the interval between 1568 and 1575, there had been formed, in some provinces and towns, other local associations for the defence of the Catholic Church against the heretics. When, in 1575, first the Duke of Anjou and after him the King of Navarre were seen flying from the court of Henry III, and commencing an insurrection with the aid of a considerable body of German auxiliaries and French refugees, already on French soil and on their way across Champagne, the peril of the Catholic Church appeared so grave and so urgent that in the threatened provinces the Catholics devoted themselves with ardor to the formation of a grand association for the defence of their cause. Then and thus was really born the League, secret at first, but before long publicly and openly proclaimed, which held so important a place in the history of the 16th century. Picardy and Champagne were the first scene of its formation. But in the neighboring provinces the same travail took place and brought forth fruits. At Paris, a burgess named La Roche Blanc, and devoted to the Guises, a perfumer named Peter de la Bruyere, and his son Mathieu de la Bruyere, councillor at the Châtelet, were, says de Thou, the first and most zealous preachers of the Union. "At their solicitation," continues the austere magistrate, "all the debauchees were there in this great city, all folks whose only hope was in civil war for the indulgence of their libertinism, or for a safe means of satisfying their avarice or their ambition, enrolled themselves emulously in this force. Many, even of the richest burgesses, whose hatred for Protestants blinded them so far as not to see the dangers to which such associations expose public tranquillity in a well regulated state, had the weakness to join the seditious." Many asked for time to consider, and before making any engagement they went to see President de Thou, informed him of these secret assemblies and all that went on there, and begged him to tell them whether he approved of them, and whether it was true that the court authorized them. M. de Thou answered them at once, with the straightforwardness which was innate in him, that these kinds of proceedings had not yet come to his knowledge, that he doubted whether they had the approbation of His Majesty, and that they would do wisely to hold aloof from all such associations. The authority of this great man began to throw suspicion upon the designs of the Unionists, and his reply prevented many persons from casting in their lot with the party. But they who found themselves at the head of this faction were not the folks to so easily give up their projects, for they felt themselves too well supported at court and amongst the people. They advised the Lorraine princes to have the Union promulgated in the provinces, and to labor to make the nobility of the kingdom enter it. Henry de Guise did not hesitate. At the same time that he avowed the League and labored to propagate it, he did what was far more effectual for its success: he entered the field and gained a victory. The German allies and French refugees who had come to support Prince Henry de Conde and the Duke of Anjou in their insurrection advanced into Champagne. Guise had nothing ready, neither army nor money. He mustered in haste 3,000 horse, who were to be followed by a body of foot and a moiety of the king's guards. "I haven't a son," he wrote to his wife. "Take some out of the king's chest, if there is anything there. Provided you know that there is something there, don't be afraid. Take it and send it me at once. As for the Rêtres, they are more afraid of us than we of them. Don't be frightened about them on my account. The greatest danger I shall run will be that a glass of wine may break in my hand." He set out in pursuit of the Germans, came up with them on the 10th of October, 1575, at Port-à-Binson, on the Marne, and ordered them to be attacked by his brother, the Duke of Mayenne, whom he supported vigorously. They were broken and routed. The hunt, according to the expression at the time, lasted all the rest of the day and during the night. "A world of dead covers the field of battle," wrote Guise. He had himself been wounded. He went in obstinate pursuit of a mounted foe whom he had twice touched with his sword, and who, in return, had fired 2 pistol shots, of which one took effect in the leg, and the other carried away part of his cheek and his left ear. Thence came his name of Henry the Scarred, le Balafré, which has clung to him in history. Scarcely 4 years had rolled away since St. Bartholomew. In vain had been the massacre of 10,000 Protestants, according to the lowest, and of 100,000, according to the highest estimates, besides nearly all the renowned chiefs of the party. Charles IX.'s earnest prayer, "that none remained to reproach me," was so far from accomplishment that the war between Catholicism and Protestantism recommenced in almost every part of France with redoubled passion, with a new importance of character, and with symptoms of much longer duration than at its first outbreak. Both parties had found leaders made, both from their position and their capacity to command them. Admiral Coligny was succeeded by the King of Navarre, who was destined to become Henry IV., and Duke Francis of Guise by his son Henry, if not as able, at any rate as brave a soldier, and a more determined Catholic than he. Amongst the Protestants, Sully and Duplessis Mornay were assuming shape and importance by the side of the King of Navarre. Catherine de' Medici placed at her son's service her Italian adroitness, her maternal devotion, and an energy rare for a woman between 60 and 70 years of age, for 43 years a queen, and worn out by intrigue and business and pleasure. Finally, to the question of religion, the primary cause of the struggle, was added a question of kingship, kept in the background, but ever present in thought and deed, which of the 3 houses of Valois, Bourbon, and Lorraine should remain in or enter upon the possession of the throne of France. The interests and the ambition of families and of individuals were playing their part simultaneously with the controversies and the passions of creed. This state of things continued for 12 years, from 1576 to 1588, with constant alternations of war, truce, and precarious peace, and in the midst of constant hesitation, on the part of Henry III., between alliance with the League, commanded by the Duke of Guise, and adjustment with the Protestants, of whom the King of Navarre was every day becoming the more and more avowed leader. Between 1576 and 1580, 4 treaties of peace were concluded. In 1576, the peace called Monsieur's, signed at Chastenay in Orleanness. In 1577, the peace of Bergerac, or of Poitiers. In 1579, the peace of Nerac. In 1580, the peace of Flèche in Périgord. In November 1578, the States General were convoked and assembled at Blois, where they sat and deliberated up to March 1577, without any important result. Neither these diplomatic conventions nor these national assemblies had force enough to establish a real and lasting peace between the 2 parties, for the parties themselves would not have it. In vain did Henry III. Make concessions and promises of liberty to the Protestants. He was not in a condition to guarantee their execution and make it respected by their adversaries. At heart, neither Protestants nor Catholics were for accepting mutual liberty. Not only did they both consider themselves in possession of all religious truth, but they also considered themselves entitled to impose it by force upon their adversaries. The discovery, and the term is used advisedly, so slow to come and so long awaited has been the fact which it expresses, the discovery of the legitimate separation between the intellectual world and the political world, and of the necessity also of having the intellectual world free in order that it may not make upon the political world a war, which, in the inevitable contact between them, the latter could not support for long, this grand and salutary discovery, be it repeated, and its practical influence in the government of people, cannot be realized save in communities already highly enlightened and politically well ordered. Good order, politically, is indispensable if liberty, intellectually, is to develop itself regularly and do the community more good than it causes of trouble and embarrassment. They only who have confidence in human intelligence sincerely admit its right to freedom; and confidence in human intelligence is possible only in the midst of a political regimen which likewise gives the human community the guarantees whereof its interests and its lasting security have absolute need. The 16th century was a long way from these conditions of harmony between the intellectual world and the political world, the necessity of which is beginning to be understood and admitted by only the most civilized and best governed among modern communities. It is one of the most tardy and difficult advances that people have to accomplish in their life of labor. The 16th century helped France to make considerable strides in civilization and intellectual development, but the 18th and 19th have taught her how great still, in the art of governing and being governed as a free people, are her children's want of foresight and inexperience, and to what extent they require a strong and sound organization of political freedom in order that they may without danger enjoy intellectual freedom, its pleasures and its glories. From 1576 to 1588 Henry III. Had seen the difficulties of his government continuing and increasing. His attempt to maintain his own independence and the mastery of the situation between Catholics and Protestants by making concessions and promises at one time to the former and at another to the latter had not succeeded, and in 1584 it became still more difficult to practice. On the 10th of June in that year, Henry III.'s brother, the Duke of Anjou, died at Chateau Thierry. By this death the leader of the Protestants, Henry, King of Navarre, became lawful heir to the throne of France. The Leaguers could not stomach that prospect. The Guises turned it to formidable account. They did not hesitate to make the future of France a subject of negotiation with Philip II. Of Spain, at that time her most dangerous enemy in Europe. By a secret convention concluded at Joinville on the 31st of December, 1584, between Philip and the Guises, it was stipulated that at the death of Henry III. The crown should pass to Charles, Cardinal of Bourbon, 64 years of age, the King of Navarre's uncle, who, in order to make himself king, undertook to set aside his nephew's hereditary right, and forbid absolutely heretical worship in France. He published on the 31st of March, 1585, a declaration wherein he styled himself Premier Prince of the Blood, and conferred upon the Duke of Guise the title of Lieutenant General of the League. By a bull of September 10, 1585, Sixtus V., but lately elected pope, excommunicated the King of Navarre as a heretic, and relapsed, denying him any right of succession to the crown of France, and releasing his Navarrese subjects from their oath of fidelity. Sixtus V. did not yet know what manner of man he was thus attacking. The King of Navarre did not confine himself to protesting in France, on the 10th of June, 1585, against this act of the pope's. He had his protest placarded at Rome itself upon the statues of Pasquin and Marforio, and at the very doors of the Vatican, referring the pope, as to the question of heresy, to a council which he claimed at an early date, and at the same time appealing against this alleged abuse of power to the Court of Peers of France, "of whom," said he, "I have the honor to be the premier." The whole of Italy, including Sixtus V. himself, a pope of independent mind and proud heart, was struck with this energetic resistance on the part of a petty king. "It would be a good thing," said the pope to Marquis Pasani, Henry III.'s ambassador, "if the king your master showed as much resolution against his enemies as the King of Navarre shows against those who attack him." At the first moment, Henry III. Had appeared to unravel the intentions of the League and to be disposed to resist it. By an edict of March 28, 1585, he had ordered that its adherents should be prosecuted. But Catherine de' Medici frightened him with the war which would infallibly be kindled, and in which he would have for enemies all the Catholics, more irritated than ever; and Henry III. Very easily took fright. Catherine undertook to manage the recoil for him. "I care not who likes it and who doesn't," she was wont to say in such cases. She asked the Duke of Guise for an interview, which took place, first of all at Epernay, and afterwards at Rheims. The hard demands of the Lorrainers did not deter the queen mother, and on the 7th of July, 1585, a treaty was concluded at Nemours between Henry III. And the League, to the effect "that by an irrevocable edict the practice of the new religion should be forbidden, and that there should henceforth be no other practice of religion throughout the realm of France save that of the Catholic, Apostolic, and Roman; that all the ministers should depart from the kingdom within a month; that all the subjects of his Majesty should be bound to live according to the Catholic religion, and make profession thereof within 6 months, on pain of confiscation both of person and goods; that heretics, of whatsoever quality they might be, should be declared incapable of holding benefices, public offices, positions, and dignities; that the places which had been given in guardianship to them for their security should be taken back again forthwith; and lastly, that the princes designated in the treaty, amongst whom were all the Guises at the top, should receive as guarantee certain places to be held by them for 5 years." This treaty was signed by all the negotiators, and specially by the queen mother, the Cardinals of Bourbon and Guise, and the Dukes of Guise and Mayenne. It was the decisive act which made the war a war of religion. Section 47. Section 49 of A Popular History of France, Volume 4. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Recording by Kathy Barrett. A Popular History of France from the Earliest Times, Volume 4, by François Guizot, translated by Robert Black. Chapter 34. Henry III and the Religious Wars, 1574 to 1589, Part 4. And what was Henry III, King of France, doing whilst 2 great parties and 2 great men were thus carrying on around his throne and in his name so passionate a war, on the one side to maintain the despotic unity of Catholic Christianism, and on the other to win religious liberty for Christian Protestantism? We will borrow here the words of the most enlightened and most impartial historian of the 16th century, M. de Thou. If we acted upon our own personal impressions alone, there would be danger of appearing too severe towards a king whom we profoundly despise. After having stayed some time in Bourbonness, Henry III went to Lyons in order to be within hail of his 2 favorites, Joyeuse and Epernon, who were each on the march with an army. Whilst he was at Lyons, as unconcerned as if all the realm were enjoying perfect peace, he took to collecting those little dogs which are thought so much of in that town. Everybody was greatly surprised to see a king of France, in the midst of so terrible a war and in extreme want of money, expending upon such pleasures all the time he had at disposal and all the sums he could scrape together. How lavish soever this prince may have been, yet, if comparison be made between the expenditure upon the royal household and that incurred at Lyons for dogs, the latter will be found infinitely higher than the former. Without counting expenses for hunting dogs and birds, which always come to a considerable sum in the households of kings, it cost him every year more than 100,000 gold crowns for little Lyonnese dogs, and he maintained at his court, with large salaries, a multitude of men and women who had nothing to do but to feed them. He also spent large sums in monkeys, parrots, and other creatures from foreign countries, of which he always kept a great number. Sometimes he got tired of them, and gave them all away, then his passion for such creatures returned, and they had to be found for him at no matter what cost. Since I am upon the subject of this prince's attachment to matters anything but worthy of the kingly majesty, I will say a word about his passion for those miniatures which were to be found in manuscript prayer books, and which, before the practice of printing, were done by the most skilful painters. Henry III seemed to buy such works, intended for princes and laid by in cabinets of curiosities, only to spoil them. As soon as he had them, he cut them out, and then pasted them upon the walls of his chapels, as children do. An incomprehensible character of mind; in certain things capable of upholding his rank, in some rising above his position, in others sinking below childishness." A mind and character incomprehensible indeed, if corruption, lassitude, listlessness, and fear would not explain the existence of everything that is abnormal and pitiable about human nature in a feeble, cold, and selfish creature, excited, and at the same time worn out by the business and the pleasures of kingship, which Henry III could neither do without nor bear the burden of. His perplexity was extreme in his relations with the other 2 Henrys, who gave, like himself, their name to this war, which was called by contemporaries the War of the 3 Henrys. The successes of Henry de Guise and of Henry de Bourbon were almost equally disagreeable to Henry de Valois. It is probable that if he could have chosen, he would have preferred those of Henry de Bourbon. If they caused him jealousy, they did not raise in him the same distrust. He knew the King of Navarre's loyalty, and did not suspect him of aiming to become, whilst he himself was living, King of France. Besides, he considered the Protestants less powerful and less formidable than the Leaguers. Henry de Guise, on the contrary, was evidently, in his eyes, an ambitious conspirator, determined to push his own fortunes on to the very crown of France, if the chances were favorable to him, and not only armed with all the power of Catholicism, but urged forward by the passions of the League, perhaps further, and certainly more quickly, than his own intentions travelled. Since 1584, the Leaguers had, at Paris, acquired strong organization amongst the populace. The city had been partitioned out into 5 districts, under 5 heads, who shortly afterwards added to themselves 11 others, in order that in the secret council of the association each amongst the 16 quarters of Paris might have its representative and director. Thence the famous Committee of 16, which played so great and so formidable a part in the history of that period. It was religious fanaticism and democratic fanaticism closely united, and in a position to impose their wills upon their most eminent leaders, upon the Duke of Guise himself. In vain did Henry III. Attempt to resume some sort of authority in Paris. His government, his public and private life, and his person were daily attacked, insulted, and menaced from the elevation of the pulpit and in the public thoroughfares by qualified preachers or mob orators. On the 16th of December, 1587, the Sorbonne voted, after a deliberation which it was said was to be kept secret, "that the government might be taken away from princes who were found not what they ought to be, just as the administration of a property from a guardian open to suspicion." On the 30th of December, the king summoned to the Louvre his court of Parliament and the faculty of theology. "I know of your precious resolution of the 16th of this month," said he to the Sorbonne. "I have been requested to take no notice of it, seeing that it was passed after dinner. I have no mind to avenge myself for these outrages as I might, and as Pope Sixtus V. did when he sent to the galleys certain Cordeliers for having dared to slander him in their sermons. There is not one of you who has not deserved as much and more. But it is my good pleasure to forget all, and to pardon you, on condition of its not occurring again. If it should, I beg my court of Parliament here present to exact exemplary justice, and such as the seditious, like you, may take warning by, so as to mind their own business." At their exit after this address, the Parliament and the Sorbonne, being quite sure that the king would not carry the matter further, withdrew smiling, and saying, "He certainly has spirit, but not enough of it," or habet quidem animum, sed non satis animi. The Duke of Guise's sister, the Duchess of Montpensier, took to getting up and spreading about all sorts of pamphlets against the king and his government. "The king commanded her to quit his city of Paris. She did nothing of the kind, and 3 days after she was even brazen enough to say that she carried at her waist the scissors which would give a 3rd crown to brother Henry de Valois." At the close of 1587, the Duke of Guise made a trip to Rome, "with a suite of 5, and he only remained 3 days, so disguised that he was not recognized there, and discovered himself to nobody but Cardinal Pelleve, with whom he was in communication day and night." 18 months previously, the cardinal had given a very favorable reception to a case drawn up by an advocate in the Parliament of Paris, named David, who maintained that, "although the line of the Capet had succeeded to the temporal administration of the kingdom of Charlemagne, it had not succeeded to the apostolic benediction, which appertained to none but the posterity of the said Charlemagne, and that the line of Capet being some of them possessed by a spirit of giddiness and stupidity, and others heretic and excommunicated, the time had come for restoring the crown to the true heirs." That is to say, to the house of Lorraine, which claimed to be issue of Charlemagne. This case was passed on, it is said, from Rome to Philip II., King of Spain, and M. de Saint Goard, ambassador of France at Madrid, sent Henry III. a copy of it. Whatever may have been the truth about this trip to Rome on the part of the Duke of Guise, and its influence upon what followed, the chiefs of the Leaguers resolved to deal a great blow. The Lorraine princes and their intimate associates met at Nancy in January 1588, and decided that a petition should be presented to the king, that he should be called upon to join himself more openly and in good earnest to the League, and to remove from offices of consequence all the persons that should be pointed out to him; that the Holy Inquisition should be established, at any rate in the good towns; that important places should be put into the hands of specified chiefs, who should have the power of constructing fortifications there; that heretics should be taxed a third, or at the least a fourth, of their property as long as the war lasted; and lastly, that the life should be spared of no enemy taken prisoner, unless upon his swearing and finding good surety to live as a Catholic, and upon paying in ready money the worth of his property if it had not already been sold. These monstrous proposals, drawn up in 11 articles, were immediately carried to the king. He did not reject them, but he demanded and took time to discuss them with the authors. The negotiation was prolonged. The ferment in Paris was redoubled. The king, it was said, meant to withdraw; his person must be secured. The Committee of 16 took measures to that end; one of its members got into his hands the keys of the gate of Saint Denis. From Soissons, where he was staying, the Duke of Guise sent to Paris the Count of Brissac, with 4 other captains of the League, to hold themselves in readiness for any event, and he ordered his brother, the Duke of Aumale, to stoutly maintain his garrisons in the places of Picardy, which the king, it was said, meant to take from him. "If the king leaves Paris," the duke wrote to Bernard de Mendoza, Philip II.'s ambassador in France, "I will make him think about returning thither before he has gone a day's march towards the Picards." Philip II. made Guise an offer of 300,000 crowns, 6,000 lanzknechts, and 1,200 lances, as soon as he should have broken with Henry III. "The abscess will soon burst," wrote the ambassador to the king, his master. On the 8th of May, 1588, at 11 p.m., the Duke of Guise set out from Soissons, after having commended himself to the prayers of the convents in the town. He arrived the next morning before Paris, which he entered about midday by the gate of Saint Martin. The Leaguers had been expecting him for several days. Though he had covered his head with his cloak, he was readily recognized and eagerly cheered. The burgesses left their houses and the tradesmen their shops to see him and follow him, shouting, "Hurrah for Guise! Hurrah for the pillar of the church!" The crowd increased at every step. He arrived in front of the palace of Catherine de' Medici, who had not expected him, and grew pale at sight of him. "My dear cousin," said she to him, "I am very glad to see you, but I should have been better pleased at another time." "Madame, I am come to clear myself from all the calumnies of my enemies; do me the honor to conduct me to the king yourself." Catherine lost no time in giving the king warning by one of her secretaries. On receipt of this notice, Henry III., who had at first been stolid and silent, rose abruptly from his chair. "Tell my lady mother that, as she wishes to present the Duke of Guise to me, I will receive him in the chamber of the queen my wife." The envoy departed. The king, turning to one of his officers, Colonel Alfonso Corso, said to him, "Monsieur de Guise has just arrived at Paris, contrary to my orders. What would you do in my place?" "Sir, do you hold the Duke of Guise for friend or enemy?" The king, without speaking, replied by a significant gesture. "If it please your Majesty to give me the order, I will this very day lay the duke's head at your feet." The 3 councillors who happened to be there cried out. The king held his peace. During this conversation at the Louvre, the Duke of Guise was advancing along the streets, dressed in a doublet of white damask, a cloak of black cloth, and boots of buffalo hide. He walked on foot, bareheaded, at the side of the queen mother in a sedan chair. He was tall, with fair, clustering hair and piercing eyes, and his scar added to his martial air. The mob pressed upon his steps. Flowers were thrown to him from the windows. Some, adoring him as a saint, touched him with chaplets which they afterwards kissed. A young girl darted towards him, and, removing her mask, kissed him, saying, "Brave prince, since you are here, we are all saved." Guise, with a dignified air, "saluted and delighted everybody," says a witness, "with eye and gesture and speech." "By his side," said Madame de Retz, "the other princes are commoners." "The Huguenots," said another, "become Leaguers at the very sight of him." On arriving at the Louvre, he traversed the court between 2 rows of soldiers, the archers on duty in the hall, and the 45 gentlemen of the king's chamber at the top of the staircase. "What brings you hither?" said the king, with difficulty restraining his anger. "I entreat your Majesty to believe in my fidelity, and not allow yourself to go by the reports of my enemies." "Did I not command you not to come at this season so full of suspicions, but to wait yet a while?" "Sir, I was not given to understand that my coming would be disagreeable to you." Catherine drew near, and in a low tone told her son of the demonstrations of which the duke had been the object on his way. Guise was received in the chamber of the queen, Louise de Vaudemont, who was confined to her bed by indisposition. He chatted with her a moment, and, saluting the king, retired without being attended by any one of the officers of the court. Henry III. confined himself to telling him that results should speak for the sincerity of his words. Guise returned to his house in the Faubourg Saint Antoine, still accompanied by an eager and noisy crowd, but somewhat disquieted at heart both by the king's angry reception and the people's enthusiastic welcome. Brave as he was more ambitious in conception than bold in execution, and he had not made up his mind to do all that was necessary to attain the end he was pursuing. The Committee of 16, his confidants, and all the staff of the League met at his house during the evening and night between the 9th and 10th of May, preparing for the morrow's action without well knowing what it was to be, proposing various plans, collecting arms, and giving instructions to their agents amongst the populace. An agitation of the same sort prevailed at the Louvre. The king, too, was deliberating with his advisers as to what he should do on the morrow. Guise would undoubtedly present himself at his morning levee. Should he at once rid himself of him by the poniards of the 45 bravos which the Duke of Epernon had enrolled in Gascony for his service? Or would it be best to summon to Paris some troops, French and Swiss, to crush the Parisian rebels and the adventurers that had hurried up from all parts to their aid? But on the 10th of May, Guise went to the Louvre with 400 gentlemen well armed with breastplates and weapons under their cloaks. The king did nothing. No more did Guise. The two had a long conversation in the queen mother's garden, but it led to no result. On the 11th of May, in the evening, the provost of tradesmen, Hector de Perreuse, assembled the town council and those of the district colonels on whom he had reliance to receive the king's orders. Orders came to muster the burgher companies of certain districts and send them to occupy certain positions that had been determined upon. They mustered slowly and incompletely, and some not at all, and scarcely had they arrived when several left the posts which had been assigned to them. The king, being informed of this sluggishness, sent for the regiment of the French Guards, and for 4,000 Swiss cantoned in the outskirts of Paris; and he himself mounted his horse on the 12th of May, in the morning, to go and receive them at the gate of Saint Honore. These troops "filed along, without fife or drum, towards the cemetery of the Innocents." The populace regarded them as they passed with a feeling of angry curiosity and uneasy amazement. When all the corps had arrived at the appointed spot, "they put themselves in motion towards different points, now making a great noise with their drums and fifes, which marvellously astonished the inhabitants of the quarter." Noise provokes noise. "Incontinently," says L'Estoile, "everybody seizes his arms, goes out on guard in the streets and cantons; in less than no time chains are stretched across and barricades made at the corners of the streets. The mechanic leaves his tools, the tradesman his business, the university their books, the attorneys their bags, the advocates their bands, the presidents and councillors themselves take halberds in hand. Nothing is heard but shouts, murmurs, and the seditious speeches that heat and alarm a people." The tocsin sounded everywhere. Barricades sprang up in the twinkling of an eye. They were made within 30 paces of the Louvre. The royal troops were hemmed in where they stood, and deprived of the possibility of moving. The Swiss, being attacked, lost 50 men and surrendered, holding up their chaplets and exclaiming that they were good Catholics. It was thought sufficient to disarm the French guards. The king, remaining stationary at the Louvre, sent his marshals to parley with the people massed in the thoroughfares. The queen mother had herself carried over the barricades in order to go to Guise's house and attempt some negotiation with him. He received her coldly, demanding that the king should appoint him lieutenant general of the kingdom, declare the Huguenot princes incapacitated from succeeding to the throne, and assemble the states general. At the approach of evening, Guise determined to go himself and assume the conqueror's air by putting a stop to the insurrection. He issued from his house on horseback, unarmed, with a white wand in his hand. He rode through the different districts, exhorting the inhabitants to keep up their barricades, whilst remaining on the defensive and leaving him to complete their work. He was greeted on all sides with shouts of "Hurrah for Guise!" "You wrong me, my friends," said he; "you should shout, 'Hurrah for the king!'" He had the French guards and the Swiss set at liberty; and they defiled before him, arms lowered and bareheaded, as before their preserver. Next morning, May 13, he wrote to d'Entragues, governor of Orleans, "Notify our friends to come to us in the greatest haste possible, with horses and arms, but without baggage, which they will easily be able to do, for I believe that the roads are open hence to you. I have defeated the Swiss, and cut in pieces a part of the king's guards, and I hold the Louvre invested so closely that I will render good account of whatsoever there is in it. This is so great a victory that it will be remembered for ever." That same day the provost of tradesmen and the royalist sheriffs repaired to the Louvre, and told the king that without great and immediate concessions they could not answer for anything. The Louvre was not in a condition of defence; there were no troops to be depended upon for resistance, no provisions, no munitions. The investment was growing closer and closer every hour, and the assault might commence at any instant. Henry III. sent his mother once more to the Duke of Guise, and himself went out about 4 o'clock, dressed in a country suit and scantily attended, as if for a walk in the Tuileries. Catherine found the duke as inflexible as he had been the day before. He peremptorily insisted upon all the conditions he had laid down already: the lieutenant generalship of the kingdom for himself, the unity of the Catholic faith, forfeiture on the part of the King of Navarre and every other Huguenot prince as heir to the throne, perpetual banishment of the king's favorites, and convocation of the states general. "The king," he said, "purposes to destroy all the grandees of the kingdom and to harry all those who oppose his wishes and the elevation of his minions. It is my duty and my interest to take all the measures necessary for my own preservation and that of the people." Catherine yielded on nearly every point, at the same time, however, continually resuming and prolonging the discussion. One of the duke's most trusty confidants, Francis de Mainville, entered and whispered in his ear. "Madame," cried the duke, "whilst your Majesty has been amusing me here, the king is off from Paris to harry me and destroy me." Henry III., indeed, had taken horse at the Tuileries, and, attended by his principal councillors, unbooted and cloakless, had issued from the New Gate and set out on the road to Saint Cloud. Equipping him in haste, his squire, Du Halde, had put his spur on wrong, and would have it set right, but, "That will do," said the king; "I am not going to see my mistress; I have a longer journey to make." It is said that the corps on guard at the Nesle gate fired from a distance a salute of arquebus after the fugitive king, and that a crowd assembled on the other bank of the river shouted insults after him. At the height of Chaillot, Henry pulled up, and turning round towards Paris, "Ungrateful city," he cried, "I have loved thee more than my own wife; I will not enter thy walls again but by the breach." End of section 49. Section 50 of A Popular History of France, Volume 4. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Recording by Kathy Barrett. A Popular History of France from the Earliest Times, Volume 4, by François Guizot. Translated by Robert Black. Chapter 34. Henry III. And the Religious Wars, 1574 to 1589, Part 5. It is said that, on hearing of the Duke of Guise's sudden arrival at Paris, Pope Sixtus V. exclaimed, "Ah, what rashness, to thus go and put himself in the hands of a prince he has so outraged!" And some days afterwards, on the news that the king had received the Duke of Guise and nothing had come of it, "Ah, dastard prince, poor creature of a prince, to have let such a chance escape him of getting rid of a man who seems born to be his destruction." When the king was gone, Guise acted the master in Paris. He ordered the immediate delivery into his hands of the Bastille, the Arsenal, and the castle of Vincennes. Ornano, governor of the Bastille, sent an offer to the king, who had arrived at Chartres, to defend it to the last extremity, "I will not expose to so certain a peril a brave man who may be necessary to me elsewhere," replied the king. Guise caused to be elected at Paris a new town council and a new provost of tradesmen, all taken from amongst the most ardent Leaguers. He at the same time exerted himself to restore order. He allowed all royalists who wished to depart to withdraw to Chartres. He went in person and pressed the premier president of Parliament, Achille de Harlay, to resume the course of justice. "It is great pity, sir," said Harlay, "when the servant drives out the master. This assembly is founded (seated) on the fleur de lis. Being established by the king, it can act only for his service. We will all lose our lives to a man rather than give way a whit to the contrary." "I have been in many battles," said Guise as he went out, "in assaults and encounters the most dangerous in the world, and I have never been so overcome as at my reception by this personage." At the same time that he was trying to exercise authority and restore order, unbridled violence and anarchy were making head around him. The 16 and their friends discharged from the smallest offices, civil or religious, whoever was not devoted to them. They changed all the captains and district officers of the city militia. They deposed all the incumbents, all the ecclesiastics whom they termed Huguenots and policists. The pulpits of Christians became the platforms of demagogues. The preachers Guiticestre, Boucher, Rose, John Prévost, Aubry, Piganat, Cuilly, Pelletier, and a host of others, whose names have fallen into complete obscurity, were the popular apostles, the real firebrands of the troubles of the League, says Pasquier. There was scarcely a chapel where there were not several sermons a day. "You know not your strength," they kept repeating to their auditors. "Paris knows not what she is worth; she has wealth enough to make war upon 4 kings. France is sick, and she will never recover from that sickness till she has a draught of French blood given her. If you receive Henry de Valois into your towns, make up your minds to see your preachers massacred, your sheriffs hanged, your women violated, and the gibbets garnished with your members." One of these raving orators, Claude Trahy, provincial of the Cordeliers, devoted himself to hounding on the populace of Auxerre against their bishop, James Amiot, the translator of Plutarch, whom he reproached with "having communicated with Henry III. And administered to him the Eucharist." Brother John Moressin, one of Trahy's subalterns, went about brandishing a halbert in the public place at Auxerre and shouting, "Courage, lads! Messire Amiot is a wicked man, worse than Henry de Valois. He has threatened to have our master Trahy hanged, but he will repent it." And, "at the voice of this madman, there hurried up vine dressers, boatmen, and marchands d'eau (costermongers), a whole angry mob, who were for having Amiot's throat cut and Trahy made bishop in his stead." Whilst the blind passions of fanatics and demagogues were thus let loose, the sensible and clear sighted spirits, the earnest and moderate royalists, did not all of them remain silent and motionless. After the appearance of the letters written in 1588 by the Duke of Guise to explain and justify his conduct in this crisis, a grandson of Chancellor de l'Hospital, Michael Hureau, Sieur du Fay, published a document entitled Frank and Free Discourse upon the Condition of France, one of the most judicious and most eloquent pamphlets of the 16th century, a profound criticism upon the acts of the Duke of Guise, their causes and consequences, and a true picture of the falsehoods and servitude into which an eminent man may fall when he makes himself the tool of a popular faction, in the hope of making that faction the tool of his personal ambition. But even the men who were sufficiently enlightened and sufficiently courageous to tell the League and its leader plain truths spoke only rather late in the day, and at first without giving their names. The document written by L'Hospital's grandson did not appear until 1591, after the death of Henry III. And Henry de Guise, and it remained anonymous for some time. One cannot be astonished at such timidity. Guise himself was timid before the Leaguers, and he always ended by yielding to them in essentials, after having attempted to resist them upon such and such an incidental point. His own people accused him of lacking boldness, and his sister, the Duchess of Montpensier, openly patronized the most violent preachers, whilst boasting that she wielded more influence through them than her brother by his armies. Henry III., under stress of his enemy's zeal and his own servant's weakness, Catherine de' Medici included, after having fled from Paris and taken refuge at Chartres to escape the triumph of the barricades, once more began to negotiate, that is, to capitulate, with the League. He issued at Rouen, on the 19th of July, 1588, an edict in 11 articles, whereby he granted more than had been demanded, and more than he had promised in 1585 by the treaty of Nemours. Over and above the measures contained in that treaty against the Huguenots, in respect of the present and the future, he added 4 fresh surety towns, amongst others Bourges and Orleans, to those of which the Leaguers were to remain in possession. He declared, moreover, "that no investigation should be made into any understandings, associations, and other matters into which our Catholic subjects might have entered together, inasmuch as they have given us to understand, and have informed us, that what they did was but owing to the zeal they felt for the preservation and maintenance of the Catholic religion." By thus releasing the League from all responsibility for the past, and by giving this new treaty the name of Edict of Union, Henry III. Flattered himself, it is said, that he was thus putting himself at the head of a new grand Catholic League, which would become royalist again, inasmuch as the king was granting it all it had desired. The Edict of Union was enregistered at the Parliament of Paris on the 21st of July. The States General were convoked for the 15th of October following. "On Tuesday, August 2, his Majesty," says L'Estoile, "being entertained by the Duke of Guise during his dinner, asked him for drink, and then said to him, 'To whom shall we drink?' 'To whom you please, sir,' answered the duke. 'It is for your Majesty to command.' 'Cousin,' said the king, 'drink we to our good friends the Huguenots.' 'It is well said, sir,' answered the duke. 'And to our good barricaders,' said the king, 'let us not forget them.' Whereupon the duke began to laugh a little, says L'Estoile, but a sort of laugh that did not go beyond the knot of the throat, being dissatisfied at the novel union the king was pleased to make of the Huguenots with the barricaders." What must have, to some extent, reassured the Duke of Guise was that a Te Deum was celebrated at Notre Dame for the King of Navarre's exclusion from all right to the crown, and that on the 14th of August Henry de Guise was appointed generalissimo of the royal armies. The States General met at Blois on the 16th of October, 1588. They numbered 505 deputies, 191 of the third estate, 180 of the noblesse, 134 of the clergy. The king had given orders "to conduct each deputy as they arrived to his cabinet, that he might see, hear, and know them all personally." When the 505 deputies had taken their places in the hall, the Duke of Guise went to fetch the king, who made his entry attended by the princes of the blood, and opened the session with the dignity and easy grace which all the Valois seem to have inherited from Francis I. The Duke of Guise, in a coat of white satin, was seated at the king's feet, as high steward of his household, scanning the whole assembly with his piercing glance, as if to keep watch over those who were in his service. "He seemed," says a contemporary, "by a single flash of his eye to fortify them in the hope of the advancement of his designs, his fortunes, and his greatness, and to say to them, without speaking, 'I see you.'" The king's speech was long, able, well delivered, and very much applauded, save by Guise himself and his particular friends. The firmness of tone had displeased them, and one sentence excited in them a discontent which they had found difficulty in restraining. "Certain grandees of my kingdom have formed such leagues and associations as, in every well ordered monarchy, are crimes of high treason, without the sovereign's permission. But, showing my wonted indulgence, I am quite willing to let bygones be bygones in this respect." Guise grew pale at these words. On leaving the royal session, he got his private committee to decide that the Cardinal of Guise and the Archbishop of Lyons should go to see the king, and beg him to abandon the printing of his speech, and meanwhile Guise himself sent to the printers to stop the immediate publication. Discussion took place next day in the king's cabinet, and a threat was held out to him that a portion of the deputies would quit the meeting of states. The queen mother advised her son to compromise. The king yielded, according to his custom, and gave authority for cutting out the strongest expressions, amongst others those just quoted. "The correction was accordingly made," says M. Picot, the latest and most able historian of the States General. and Henry III. Had to add this new insult to all that were rankling at the bottom of his heart since the affair of the barricades." This was, for the Duke of Guise, a first trial of his power, and great was his satisfaction at this first success. On leaving the opening session of the States General, he wrote to the Spanish ambassador Mendoza, "I handled our states so well that I made them resolve to require confirmation of the Edict of Union (of July 21 preceding) as fundamental law of the state. The king refused to do so, in rather sharp terms, to the deputies who brought the representation before him, and from that it is presumed that he inclines towards a peace with the heretics. But at last he was so pressed by the states, the which were otherwise on the point of breaking up, that he promised to swear the edict and have it sworn before entering upon consideration of any matter." The next day but one, in fact on the 18th of October, at the second session of the States General, "the edict of July 21 was read and published with the greatest solemnity. The king swore to maintain it in terms calculated to dissipate all anxieties on the part of the Catholics. The deputies swore after him. The Archbishop of Bourges delivered an address on the sanctity of oaths, and those present began to think the session over when the king rose a second time to recommend the deputies not to leave Blois before the papers were drawn up and the ordinances made. He reminded them that at the last assembly of the states the suggestions and counsels of the three estates had been so ill carried out that, instead of a reformation and an establishment of good laws, everything had been thrown into confusion. Accordingly, the king added to this suggestion a solemn oath that he would not budge from the city until he had made an edict, sacred and inviolable. The enthusiasm of the deputies was at its height. A rush took place to the church of Saint Sauveur to chant a Te Deum. All the princes were there to give thanks to God. Never were king, court, and people so joyous." The Duke of Guise wrote to the Spanish ambassador, "At length we have, in full assembly of the states, had our Edict of Union solemnly sworn and established as fundamental law of this realm, having surmounted all the difficulties and hindrances which the king was pleased to throw in the way. I found myself 4 or 5 times on the point of rupture, but I was verily assisted by so many good men." After, as well as before the opening of the States General, the friends of the Duke of Guise were far from having, all of them, the same confidence that he had in his position and in his success. "Stupid owl of a Lorrainer," said Sieur de Vins, commanding, on behalf of the League in Dauphiny, on reading the duke's despatches, "has he so little sense as to believe that a king whose crown he, by dissimulating, has been wanting to take away, is not dissimulating in turn to take away his life?" "As they are so thick together," said M. de Vins's sister, when she knew that the Duke of Guise was at Blois with the king, "you will hear, at the very first opportunity, that one or the other has killed his fellow." Guise himself was no stranger to this idea. "We are not without warnings from all quarters that there is a design of attempting my life," he wrote on the 21st of September, 1588; "but I have, thank God, so provided against it, both by the gathering I have made of a good number of my friends, and in having, by presents and money, secured a portion of those whose services are relied upon for the execution of it, that if once things begin I shall finish more roughly than I did at Paris." After the opening of the States General and the success he obtained thereat, Guise appeared, if not more anxious, at any rate more attentive to the warnings he received. On the 10th of December, 1588, he wrote to Commander Moreo, confidential agent from the King of Spain, to him, "You cannot imagine what alarms have been given me since your departure. I have so well provided against them that my enemies have not seen their way to attempting anything. But expenses have grown upon me to such an extent that I have great need of your prompt assistance. I have now so much credit with this assembly that I have hitherto made it dance to my tune, and I hope that as to what remains to be decreed, I shall be quite able to maintain the same authority." Some of his partisans advised him to go away for a while to Orleans, but he absolutely refused, repeating, with the Archbishop of Lyons, "He who leaves the game loses it." One evening, in a little circle of intimates, on the 21st of December, a question arose whether it would not be advisable to prevent the king's designs by striking at his person. The Cardinal of Guise begged his brother to go away, assuring him that his own presence would suffice for the direction of affairs, but, "They are in such case, my friend," said de Balafre, "that if I saw death coming in at the window, I would not consent to go out by the door to avoid it." His cousin, the Duke of Elbeuf, paid him a visit at night to urge him to withdraw himself from the plot hatched against him. "If it were necessary to lose my life in order to reap the proximate fruits of the state's good resolution," said Guise, "that is quite what I have made up my mind to. Though I had 100 lives, I would devote them all to the service of God and his church, and to the relief of the poor people for whom I feel the greatest pity." Then, touching the Duke of Elbeuf upon the shoulder, he said, "Go to bed, cousin;" and taking away his hand and laying it upon his own heart, he added, "Here is the doublet of innocence." On the evening of the 22d of December, 1588, when Charlotte de Semblancay, Marchioness of Noirmoutier, to whom he was tenderly attached, pressed him to depart, or at any rate not to be present at the council next day, the only answer he made her was to hum the following ditty by Desportes, a poet of the day: "My little rose, a little spell Of absence changed that heart of thine, And I, who know the change full well, Have found another place for mine. No more such fair but fickle she Shall find me her obedient, And flighty shepherdess we'll see Which of the twain will first repent." Henry III. was scarcely less disturbed, but in quite a different way, than the Duke of Guise. For a long time past he had been thinking about getting rid of the latter, just as he had thought for a long time, 20 years before, about getting rid of Admiral de Coligny. But since the date of his escape from the popular rising on the day of the barricades, he had hoped that, thanks to the adoption of the Edict of Union and to the convocation of the States General, he would escape the yoke of the Duke of Guise. He saw every day that he had been mistaken. The League, and consequently the Duke of Guise, had more power than he with the States General. In vain had the king changed nearly all his ministers. In vain had he removed his principal favorite, the Duke of Epernon, from the government of Normandy to that of Provence. He did not obtain from the States General what he demanded, that is, the money he wanted. And the states required of him administrative reforms, sound enough at bottom, but suggested by the Duke of Guise with an interested object, and calculated to shackle the kingly authority even more than could be done by Guise himself directly. At the same time that Guise was urging on the States General in this path, he demanded to be made constable, not by the king any longer, but by the states themselves. The kingship was thus being squeezed between the haughty supremacy of the great lords, substitutes for the feudal regimen, and the first essays of that free government which is nowadays called the parliamentary regimen. Henry III. determined with fear and trembling to disembarrass himself of his two rivals, of the Duke of Guise by assassination, and of the States General by packing them off home. He did not know how intimately the two great questions of which the 16th century was the great cradle, the question of religious liberty and that of political liberty, were connected one with the other, and would be prosecuted jointly or successively in the natural progress of Christian civilization, or through what trials kings and people would have to pass before succeeding in any effectual solution of them. End of section 50. Section 51 of A Popular History of France, Volume 4. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Recording by Kathy Barrett. A Popular History of France from the Earliest Times, Volume 4, by François Guizot. Translated by Robert Black. Chapter 34. Henry III. And the Religious Wars, 1574 to 1589, Part 6. On the 18th of December, 1588, during an entertainment given by Catherine de' Medici on the marriage of her niece, Christine de Lorraine, with Ferdinand de' Medici, Grand Duke of Tuscany, Henry III. Summoned to his cabinet three of his most intimate and safest confidants, Marshal d'Aumont, Nicholas d'Angennes, Lord of Rambouillet, and Sieur de Beauvais-Nangis. After having laid before them all the Duke of Guise's intrigues against him and the perils of the position in which they placed him, "What ought I to do?" he said. "Help me to save myself by some speedy means." They asked the king to give them 24 hours to answer in. Next day, the 19th, Sieur de Maintenon, brother of Rambouillet, and Alfonso Corso d'Ornano were added to the party. Only one of them was of opinion that the Duke of Guise should at once be arrested and put upon his trial. The 4 others were for a shorter and a surer process, that of putting the duke to death by a sudden blow. He is evidently making war upon the king, they said, and the king has a right to defend himself. Henry III., who had his mind made up, asked Crillon, commandant of the regiment of guards, "Think you that the Duke of Guise deserves death?" "Yes, sir." "Very well, then I choose you to give it to him." "I am ready to challenge him." "That is not what is wanted; as leader of the League he is guilty of high treason." "Very well, sir, then let him be tried and executed." "But Crillon, nothing is less certain than his conviction in a court of law; he must be struck down unexpectedly." "Sir, I am a soldier, not an assassin." The king did not persist, but merely charged Crillon, who promised, to keep the proposal secret. At this very time Guise was requesting the king to give him a constable's grand provost and archers to form his guard in his quality of lieutenant general of the kingdom. The king deferred his reply. Catherine de' Medici supported the Lorrainer prince's request. "In 2 or 3 days it shall be settled," said Henry. He had ordered 12 poniards from an armorer's in the city. On the 21st of December he told his project to Loignac, an officer of his guards, who was less scrupulous than Crillon, and undertook to strike the blow in concert with the 45 trusty guards. At the council on the 22d of December, the king announced his intention of passing Christmas in retreat at Notre Dame de Clery, and he warned the members of the council that next day the session would take place very early, in order to dispose of business before his departure. On the evening of the 22d, the Duke of Guise, on sitting down at table, found under his napkin a note to this effect: "The king means to kill you." Guise asked for a pen, wrote at the bottom of the note, "He dare not," and threw it under the table. Next day, December 23, Henry III., rising at 4 a.m. after a night of great agitation, admitted into his cabinet by a secret staircase the 9 guards he had chosen, handed them the poniards he had ordered, placed them at the post where they were to wait for the meeting of the council, and bade Charles d'Entragues to go and request one of the royal chaplains "to say mass, that God might give the king grace to be able to carry out an enterprise which he hoped would come to an issue within an hour, and on which the safety of France depended." Then the king retired into his closet. The members of the council arrived in succession. It is said that one of the archers on duty, when he saw the Duke of Guise mounting the staircase, trod on his foot, as if to give him warning; but if he observed it, Guise made no account of it, any more than of all the other hints he had already received. Before entering the council chamber, he stopped at a small oratory connected with the chapel, said his prayer, and, as he passed the door of the queen mother's apartments, signified his desire to pay his respects and have a few words with her. Catherine was indisposed, and could not receive him. Some vexation, it is said, appeared in Guise's face, but he said not a word. On entering the council chamber, he felt cold, asked to have some fire lighted, and gave orders to his secretary, Pericard, the only attendant admitted with him, to go and fetch the silver gilt shell he was in the habit of carrying about him, with damsons or other preserves to eat of a morning. Pericard was some time gone. Guise was in a hurry, and, "Be kind enough," he said to M. de Morfontaine, "to send word to M. de Saint Prix, first groom of the chamber to Henry III., that I beg him to let me have a few damsons or a little preserve of roses, or some trifle of the king's." 4 Brignol plums were brought him, and he ate one. His uneasiness continued. The eye close to his scar became moist. According to M. de Thou, he bled at the nose. He felt in his pocket for a handkerchief to use, but could not find one. "My people," said he, "have not given me my necessaries this morning; there is great excuse for them; they were too much hurried." At his request, Saint Prix had a handkerchief brought to him. Pericard passed his bonbon box to him, as the guards would not let him enter again. The duke took a few plums from it, threw the rest on the table, saying, "Gentlemen, who will have any?" and rose up hurriedly upon seeing the Secretary of State Revol, who came in and said to him, "Sir, the king wants you; he is in his old cabinet." As soon as he knew that the Duke of Guise had arrived, and whilst these little incidents were occurring in the council chamber, Henry III. Had in fact given orders to his secretary Revol to go on his behalf and summon the duke. But Nambu, usher to the council faithful to his instructions, had refused to let anybody, even the king's secretary, enter the hall. Revol, of a timid disposition, and impressed, it is said, with the sinister importance of his commission, returned to the cabinet with a very troubled air. The king, in his turn, was troubled, fearing lest his project had been discovered. "What is the matter, Revol?" said he. "What is it? How pale you are! You will spoil all. Rub your cheeks, rub your cheeks." "There is nothing wrong, sir, only M. de Nambu would not let me in without your Majesty's express command." Revol entered the council chamber and discharged his commission. The Duke of Guise pulled up his cloak as if to wrap himself well in it, took his hat, gloves, and his sweetmeat box, and went out of the room, saying, "Adieu, gentlemen," with a gravity free from any appearance of mistrust. He crossed the king's chamber contiguous to the council hall, courteously saluted, as he passed, Loignac and his comrades, whom he found drawn up, and whom, returning him a frigid obeisance, followed him as if to show him respect. On arriving at the door of the old cabinet, and just as he leaned down to raise the tapestry that covered it, Guise was struck 5 poniard blows in the chest, neck, and reins. "God ha' mercy!" he cried; and though his sword was entangled in his cloak, and he was himself pinned by the arms and legs and choked by the blood that spurted from his throat, he dragged his murderers, by a supreme effort of energy, to the other end of the room, where he fell down backwards and lifeless before the bed of Henry III., who, coming to the door of his room and asking "if it was done," contemplated with mingled satisfaction and terror the inanimate body of his mighty rival, "who seemed to be merely sleeping, so little was he changed." "My God, how tall he is!" cried the king; "he looks even taller than when he was alive." "They are killing my brother!" cried the Cardinal of Guise, when he heard the noise that was being made in the next room, and he rose up to run thither. The Archbishop of Lyons, Peter d'Espignac, did the same. The Duke of Aumont held them both back, saying, "Gentlemen, we must wait for the king's orders." Orders came to arrest them both, and confine them in a small room over the council chamber. They had "eggs, bread, wine from the king's cellar, their breviaries, their nightgowns, a palliasse, and a mattress," brought to them there, and they were kept under ocular supervision for 24 hours. The Cardinal of Guise was released the next morning, but only to be put to death like his brother. The king spared the Archbishop of Lyons. "I am sole king," said Henry III. To his ministers, as he entered the council chamber. And shortly afterwards, going to see the queen mother, who was ill of the gout, "How do you feel?" he asked. "Better," she answered. "So do I," replied the king. "I feel much better. This morning I have become King of France again. The King of Paris is dead." "You have had the Duke of Guise killed?" asked Catherine. "Have you reflected well? God grant that you become not king of nothing at all. I hope the cutting is right. Now for the sewing." According to the majority of the historians, Catherine had neither been in the secret nor had anything to do with the preparations for the measure. Granted that she took no active part in it, and that she avoided even the appearance of having any previous knowledge of it. She was not fond of responsibility, and she liked better to negotiate between the different parties than to make her decisive choice between them. Prudent tendencies grow with years, and in 1588 she was 69. It is difficult, however, to believe that, being the habitual confidant of her favorite son, she was ignorant of a design long meditated, and known to many persons many days before its execution. The event once accomplished, ill as she was, and contrary to the advice of her physicians, she had herself carried to the Cardinal of Bourbon's, who was still under arrest by the king's orders, to promise him speedy release. "Ah, madame," said the cardinal, as he saw her enter, "these are some of your tricks; you are death to us all." However it may be, 13 days after the murder of the Duke of Guise, on the 5th of January, 1589, Catherine de' Medici herself died. Nor was her death, so far as affairs and the public were concerned, an event. Her ability was of the sort which is worn out by the frequent use made of it, and which, when old age comes on, leaves no long or grateful reminiscence. Time has restored Catherine de' Medici to her proper place in history. She was quickly forgotten by her contemporaries. She had good reason to say to her son as her last advice, "Now for the sewing." It was not long before Henry III. Perceived that, to be king, it was not sufficient to have murdered his rival. He survived the Duke of Guise only 7 months, and during that short period he was not really king, all by himself, for a single day. Never had his kingship been so embarrassed and impotent. The violent death of the Duke of Guise had exasperated much more than enfeebled the League. The feeling against his murderer was passionate and contagious. The Catholic cause had lost its great leader. It found and accepted another in his brother, the Duke of Mayenne, far inferior to his elder brother in political talent and prompt energy of character, but a brave and determined soldier, a much better man of party and action than the sceptical, undecided, and indolent Henry III. The majority of the great towns of France, Paris, Rouen, Orleans, Toulouse, Lyons, Amiens, and whole provinces declared eagerly against the royal murderer. He demanded support from the States General, who refused it, and he was obliged to dismiss them. The Parliament of Paris, dismembered on the 16th of January, 1589, by the Council of 16, became the instrument of the Leaguers. The majority of the other parliaments followed the example set by that of Paris. The Sorbonne, consulted by a petition presented in the name of all Catholics, decided that Frenchmen were released from their oath of allegiance to Henry III., and might, with a good conscience, turn their arms against him. Henry made some obscure attempts to come to an arrangement with certain chiefs of the Leaguers, but they were rejected with violence. The Duke of Mayenne, having come to Paris on the 15th of February, was solemnly received at Notre Dame, amidst shouts of "Hurrah for the Catholic princes! Hurrah for the House of Lorraine!" He was declared Lieutenant General of the Crown and State of France. He organized a council general of the League, composed of 40 members, and charged with the duty of providing for all matters of war, the finance, and the police of the realm, pending a fresh convocation of States General. To counterbalance in some degree the popular element, Mayenne introduced into it 14 personages of his own choice and a certain number of magistrates and bishops. The delegates of the United Towns were to have seats at the council whenever they happened to be at Paris. "Never," says M. Henry very truly, "could the League have supposed itself to be so near becoming a government of confederated municipalities under the Directorate of Paris." There was clearly, for Henry III., but one possible ally who had a chance of doing effectual service, and that was Henry of Navarre and the Protestants. It cost Henry III. A great deal to have recourse to that party. His conscience and his pusillanimity both revolted at it equally. In spite of his moral corruption, he was a sincere Catholic, and the prospect of excommunication troubled him deeply. Catholicism, besides, was in a large majority in France. How, then, was he to treat with its foes without embroiling himself utterly with it? Meanwhile, the case was urgent. Henry was apprised by one of his confidants, Nicolas de Rambouillet, that one of the King of Navarre's confidants, Sully, who was then only Sieur de Rosny, was passing by Blois on his way to his master. He saw him and expressed to him his desire for a reconciliation with the King of Navarre, and to employ him on confidential service. The difficulty was to secure to the Protestant king and his army, then engaged in the siege of Châtellerault, a passage across the Loire. Rosny undertook Henry III's commission. He at the same time received another from Sieur de Brigueux, governor of the little town of Beaugency, who said to him, "I see well, sir, that the king is going the right way to ruin himself by timidity, irresolution, and bad advice, and that necessity will throw us into the hands of the League. For my part, I will never belong to it, and I would rather serve the King of Navarre. Tell him that I hold at Beaugency a passage over the Loire, and that if he will be pleased to send to me you or M. de Rebours, I will admit into the town him who he sends to me." Upon receiving these overtures, the King of Navarre thought a while, scratching his head. Then he said to Rosny, "Do you think that the king has good intentions towards me, and means to treat with me in good faith?" "Yes, sir, for the present, and you need have no doubt about it, for his straits constrain him thereto, having nothing to look to in his perils but your assistance." He had some dinner brought into his own cabinet for Rosny, and then made him post off at once. On arriving in the evening at Tours, whither Henry III. Had fallen back, Rosny was taken to him, about midnight, at the top of the castle. The king sent him off that very night. He consented to everything that the King of Navarre proposed, promised him a town on the Loire, and said he was ready to make with him, not a downright peace just at first, but "a good long truce, which in their two hearts would at once be an eternal peace and a sincere reconciliation." When Rosny got back to Châtellerault, "there was nothing but rejoicing. Everybody ran to meet him. He was called God Rosny," and one of his friends said to the rest, "Do you see yon man? By God, we shall all worship him, and he alone will restore France. I said so 6 years ago, and Villandry was of my opinion." End of section 51. Section 52 of A Popular History of France, Volume 4. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Recording by Kathy Barrett. A Popular History of France from the Earliest Times, Volume 4, by François Guizot. Translated by Robert Black. Chapter 34. Henry III. And the Religious Wars, 1574 to 1589, Part 7. Thus was the way paved and the beginning made between the two kings of an alliance demanded by their mutual interests, and still more strongly by the interests of France, ravaged and desolated for nearly 30 years past by religious civil wars. Henry of Navarre had profound sympathy for his country's sufferings, an ardent desire to put a stop to them, and at the same time the instinct to see clearly that the day had come when the re-establishment of harmony and common action between himself and Henry de Valois was the necessary and at the same time possible means of attaining that great result. On the 4th of March, 1589, soon after the States of Blois had been dismissed, he set before France in an eloquent manifesto the expression of his anxieties and his counsels. "I will speak freely," said he, "to myself first and then to others, that we may be all of us without excuse. Let us not be puffed up with pride on one side or another. As for me, although I have received more favors from God in this than in all past wars, and whilst the two other parties, how sad that they must be so called, are enfeebled, mine, to all appearance, has been strengthened. Nevertheless, I well know that whenever I go beyond my duty, God will no longer bless me, and I shall do so whenever, without reason and in sheer lightness of heart, I attack my king and trouble the repose of his kingdom. I declare, then, first of all to those who belong to the party of the king my lord, that if they do not counsel him to make use of me, and of the means which God hath given me for to make war, not on them of Lorraine, not on Paris, Orleans, or Toulouse, but on those who shall hinder the peace and the obedience owed to this crown, they alone will be answerable for the woes which will come upon the king and the kingdom. And as to those who still adhere to the name and party of the League, I, as a Frenchman, conjure them to put up with their losses as I do with mine, and to sacrifice their quarrels, vengeance, and ambition to the welfare of France, their mother, to the service of their king, to their own repose and ours. If they do otherwise, I hope that God will not abandon the king, and will put it into his heart to call around him his servants, myself the first, who wish for no other title, and who shall have sufficient might and good right to help him wipe out their memory from the world and their party from France. I wish these written words to go proclaiming for me throughout the world that I am ready to ask my lord the king for peace, for the repose of his kingdom, and for my own. And finally, if I find one or another so sleepy-headed or so ill-disposed that none is moved thereby, I will call God to my aid, and, true servant of my king, worthy of the honor that belongs to me as premier prince of this realm, though all the world should have conspired for its ruin, I protest before God and before man that at the risk of 10,000 lives I will essay, all alone, to prevent it." End quote. It is pleasing to think that this patriotic step and these powerful words were not without influence over the result which was attained. The King of Navarre set to work, at the same time with Rosny, one of the most eminent, and with Philip du Plessis Mornay, the most sterling of his servants. And a month after the publication of his manifesto, on the 3rd of April, 1589, a truce for a year was concluded between the two kings. It set forth that the King of Navarre should serve the King of France with all his might and main, that he should have for the movements of his troops on both banks of the Loire the place of Saumur, that the places of which he had made himself master should be handed over to Henry III, and that he might not anywhere do anything to the prejudice of the Catholic religion, that the Protestants should be no more disquieted throughout the whole of France, and that before the expiration of the truce King Henry III should give them assurance of peace. This negotiation was not concluded without difficulty, especially as regarded the town of Saumur. There was a general desire to cede to the King of Navarre only some place of less importance on the Loire; and when, on the 15th of April, du Plessis-Mornay, who had been appointed governor of it, presented himself for admittance at the head of his garrison, the royalist commandant, who had to deliver the keys to him, limited himself to letting them drop at his feet. Mornay showed alacrity in picking them up. On the 29th of April, the two kings had, each on his own behalf, made their treaty public. Henry III sent word to the King of Navarre that he wished to see him and have some conversation with him. Many of the King of Navarre's friends dissuaded him from this interview, saying, "They are traitors. Do not put yourself in their power. Remember the St. Bartholomew." This counsel was repeated to him on the 30th of April, at the very moment when he was stepping aboard the boat to cross the Loire and go to pay Henry III a visit at the castle of Plessis-les-Tours. The King of Navarre made no account of it. "God hath bidden me to cross and see him," he answered. "It is not in the power of man to keep me back, for God is guiding me and crossing with me. Of that I am certain." And he crossed the river. "It is incredible," says L'Estoile, "what joy everybody felt at this interview. There was such a throng of people that, notwithstanding all efforts to preserve order, the two kings were a full quarter of an hour in the roadway of Plessis Park, holding out their hands to one another, without being able to join them. People climbed trees to see them. All shouted with great vigor and exultation, 'Hurrah for the king! Hurrah for the King of Navarre! Hurrah for the kings!' At last, having joined hands, they embraced very lovingly, even to tears. The King of Navarre, on retiring in the evening, said, 'I shall now die happy, since God hath given me grace to look upon the face of my king and make him an offer of my services.' I know not if those were his words, but what is certain is that everybody at this time, both kings and people, except fanatical Leaguers, regarded peace as a great public blessing, and were rejoiced to have a prospect of it before their eyes. The very day of the interview, the King of Navarre wrote to du Plessis-Mornay, 'Monsieur du Plessis, the ice is broken, not without numbers of warnings that if I went I was a dead man. I crossed the water, commending myself to God, who by his goodness not only preserved me, but caused extreme joy to appear on the king's countenance, and the people to cheer so that never was the like, even shouting, 'Hurrah for the kings!' whereat I was much vexed." Some days afterwards, during the night of May 8, the Duke of Mayenne made an attack upon Tours, and carried for the moment the Faubourg Saint-Symphorien, which gave Henry III such a fright that he was on the point of leaving the city and betaking himself to a distance. But the King of Navarre, warned in time, entered Tours, and at his approach the Leaguers fell back. "When the white scarfs appeared, coming to the king's rescue, the Duke of Mayenne and his troops began shouting to them, 'Back, white scarfs, back! Chatillon, we are not set against you, but against the murderers of your father,' meaning thereby that they were set against King Henry de Valois only, and not against the Huguenots. But Chatillon, amongst the rest, answered them, 'You are all of you traitors to your country. I trample underfoot all vengeance and all private interests when the service of my prince and of the state is concerned,' which he said so loudly that even his Majesty heard it, and praised him for it, and loved him for it." The two kings determined to move on Paris and besiege it, and towards the end of July their camp was pitched before the walls. Great was the excitement throughout Europe as well as France, at the courts of Madrid and Rome as well as in the park of Plessis-les-Tours. A very serious blow for Philip II, and a very bad omen for the future of his policy, was this alliance between Henry de Valois and Henry of Navarre, between a great portion of the Catholics of France and the Protestants. Philip II had plumed himself upon being the patron of absolute power in religious as well as political matters, and the dominant power throughout Europe in the name of Catholicism and Spain. In both these respects he ran great risk of being beaten by a king of France who was a Protestant or an ally of Protestants and supported by the Protestant influence of England, Holland, and Germany. In Italy itself and in Catholic Europe Philip did not find the harmony and support for which he looked. The Republic of Venice was quietly but certainly well disposed towards France, and determined to live on good terms with a king of France, a friend of Protestants, or even himself Protestant. And what hurt Philip II still more was that Pope Sixtus V himself, though all the while upholding the unity and authority of the Roman Church, was bent upon not submitting to the yoke of Spain, and upon showing a favorable disposition towards France. "France is a very noble kingdom," he said to the Venetian ambassador Gritti. "The Church has always obtained great advantages from her. We love her beyond measure, and we are pleased to find that the Signory shares our affection." Another day he expressed to him his disapprobation of the League. "We cannot praise, indeed we must blame, the first act committed by the Duke of Guise, which was to take up arms and unite with other princes against the king. Though he made religion a pretext, he had no right to take up arms against his sovereign." And again, "The union of the King of France with the heretics is no longer a matter of doubt. But, after all, Henry of Navarre is worth a great many of Henry III. This latter will have the measure he meted to the Guises." So much equity and mental breadth on the pope's part was better suited for the Republic of Venice than for the King of Spain. "We have but one desire," wrote the Doge Cicogna to Bodero, his ambassador at Rome, "and that is to keep the European peace. We cannot believe that Sixtus V, that great pontiff, is untrue to his charge, which is to ward off from the Christian world the dangers that threaten it. In imitation of him whom he represents on earth, he will show mercy, and not proceed to acts which would drive the King of France to despair." During the great struggle with which Europe was engaged in the 16th century, the independence of states, religious tolerance, and political liberty thus sometimes found, besides their regular and declared champions, protectors, useful on occasion although they were timid, even amongst the habitual allies of Charles V.'s despotic and persecuting successor. On arriving before Paris towards the end of July, 1589, the two kings besieged it with an army of 42,000 men, the strongest and the best they had ever had under their orders. "The affairs of Henry III," says de Thou, "had changed face. Fortune was pronouncing for him." Quartered in the house of Count de Retz at St. Cloud, he could thence see quite at his ease his city of Paris. "Yonder," said he, "is the heart of the League. It is there that the blow must be struck. It was great pity to lay in ruins so beautiful and goodly a city. Still, I must settle accounts with the rebels who are in it, and who ignominiously drove me away." On Tuesday, August 1, at 8 a.m., he was told, says L'Etoile, that a monk desired to speak with him, but that his guards made a difficulty about letting him in. "Let him in," said the king. "If he is refused, it will be said that I drive monks away, and will not see them." Incontinently entered the monk, having in his sleeve a knife unsheathed. He made a profound reverence to the king, who had just got up and had nothing on but a dressing gown about his shoulders, and presented to him despatches from Count de Brienne, saying that he had further orders to tell the king privately something of importance. Then the king ordered those who were present to retire, and began reading the letter which the monk had brought, asking for a private audience afterwards. The monk, seeing the king's attention taken up with reading, drew his knife from his sleeve and drove it right into the king's small gut, below the navel, so home that he left the knife in the hole; the which the king, having drawn out with great exertion, struck the monk a blow with the point of it on his left eyebrow, crying, "Ah, wicked monk, he has killed me! Kill him!" At which cry, running quickly up, the guards and others, such as happened to be nearest, massacred this assassin of a Jacobin, who, D'Aubigne says, stretched out his two arms against the wall, counterfeiting the crucifix, whilst the blows were dealt him. Having been dragged out dead from the king's chamber, he was stripped naked to the waist, covered with his gown, and exposed to the public." Whilst Henry de Valois was thus struck down at Saint Cloud, Henry of Navarre had moved with a good number of troops to the Pre aux Clercs; and seeing Rosny, who was darting along, pistol in hand, amongst the foremost, he called one of his gentlemen and said, "Maignan, go and tell M. de Rosny to come back; he will get taken or wounded in that rash style." "I should not care to speak so to him," answered Maignan. "I will tell him that your Majesty wants him." Meanwhile up came a gentleman at a gallop, who said 3 or 4 words in the King of Navarre's ear. "My friend," said Henry to Rosny, "the king has just been wounded with a knife in the stomach; let us go and see about it. Come with me." Henry took with him 25 gentlemen. The king received him affectionately, exhorted him to change his religion for his salvation's sake in another world and his fortunes in this; and, addressing the people of quality who thronged his chamber, he said, "I do pray you, as my friends, and as your king, I order you to recognize after my death my brother here. For my satisfaction, and as your bounden duty, I pray you to swear it to him in my presence." All present took the oath. Henry III. spoke in a firm voice, and his wound was not believed to be mortal. Letters were sent in his name to the queen, to the governors of the provinces, and to the princes allied to the crown, to inform them of the accident that had happened to the king, "which, please God, will turn out to be nothing." The King of Navarre asked for some details as to the assassin. James Clement was a young Dominican who, according to report, had been a soldier before he became a monk. He was always talking of waging war against Henry de Valois, and he was called Captain Clement. He told a story about a vision he had of an angel, who had bidden him to put to death the tyrant of France, in return for which he would have the crown of martyrdom. Royalist writers report that he had been placed in personal communication with the friends of Henry de Guise, even with his sister the Duchess of Montpensier, and his brother the Duke of Mayenne. When well informed of the facts, the King of Navarre returned to his quarters at Meudon, and Rosny to his lodging at the foot of the castle. Whilst Rosny was at supper, his secretary came and said to him, "Sir, the King of Navarre, peradventure the King of France, wants you. M. d'Orthoman writes to him to make haste and come to St. Cloud if he would see the king alive." The King of Navarre at once departed. Just as he arrived at St. Cloud, he heard in the streets cries of "Ah, my God, we are lost!" He was told that the king was dead. Henry III., in fact, expired on the 2d of August, 1589, between 2 and 3 in the morning. The first persons Henry of Navarre encountered as he entered the Hotel de Retz were the officers of the Scottish Guard, who threw themselves at his feet, saying, "Ah, sir, you are now our king and our master." End of section 52. End of A Popular History of France from the Earliest Times, Volume 4, by François Guizot.